Millionaire buys an abandoned mansion and stumbles upon a mystery that changes everything. Madrid, with its grand streets and historic facades, served as the perfect backdrop for Alexander to grow his business empire. Known as a visionary, he had a knack for turning any investment into gold. From a young age, Alexander poured himself into his work, and that relentless drive helped him build a financial empire many envied. But despite all his success, there was a void he couldn't quite explain. One morning, while sipping coffee in his luxurious office, he received a call from a real estate agent. "Alexander, I've got something you might find interesting," the agent began, his voice brimming with enthusiasm. "It's a historic mansion on the outskirts of Madrid. It's been abandoned for decades, but the structure is stunning. With the right renovations, its value could skyrocket." Intrigued, Alexander asked for more details and was instantly captivated by the photos. The mansion was a 19th century masterpiece, boasting grand columns, intricate details, and a garden that, though overgrown, still carried an air of faded elegance. It was exactly the kind of project Alexander loved. "Schedule a visit," he said with a slight smile. "I want to see it in person." 2 days later, Alexander drove out to the property, nestled in a quiet, secluded area. As his car made its way down a tree-lined road, he felt a mix of curiosity and excitement. When the mansion finally came into view, partially obscured by wild vegetation, he paused to take in the scene. "It's even more striking in person," he murmured as he stepped out of the car. The facade was weathered, with broken windows and peeling paint, yet its grandeur still shone through. Alexander didn't see a crumbling house, he saw potential. Walking through the overrun garden, he imagined restoring it to its former glory. As he stepped inside, he was greeted by the creak of old wood and the smell of dust. The high ceilings, adorned with chandeliers now draped in cobwebs, and the cracked marble floors lent the space an air of melancholy. But to Alexander, it was a challenge, and he thrived on challenges. "This house has a soul," he said, his excitement evident, as the agent trailed behind him. "With the right work, it could become a true gem again." The agent smiled, pleased by Alexander's enthusiasm. "You're right. You know, there are plenty of rumors about this place," he added. "They say it hosted grand parties in the past, but also saw its share of tragedies." Alexander raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Tragedies?" The agent shrugged casually. "Old stories, nothing verified. Just local legends." Alexander wasn't the kind of man to be swayed by superstitions. For him, numbers were all that mattered, and in this case, the numbers added up. He decided to finalize the deal that very day. Back in his office, he started planning the renovation. He hired a team of architects and engineers to evaluate the structure and draft a timeline. To him, turning that mansion into a high-end property was just another milestone in his career. Yet, even as he pored over reports and discussed design possibilities, something about the mansion lingered in his mind. It was as if the place had an energy of its own, something he couldn't quite put into words. "It's just a house," he told himself, brushing off the odd feeling. Deep down, though, he sensed there was more to it. Little did Alexander know, the real treasure of the mansion wasn't in its walls or its old-world charm but in something he could never have imagined. Something that was about to change his life forever. When Alexander returned to the mansion to begin the detailed inspections, he was full of anticipation. The team of architects and engineers had already arrived, moving through the rooms and snapping photos for their report. But Alexander lingered outside. While the engineers assessed the foundations, Alexander wandered through the overgrown garden, lost in thoughts of how to transform the space into something extraordinary. But stepping inside, the atmosphere shifted. The silence was so profound that even the sound of his footsteps echoed through the empty hallways. "Time seems to have stopped here," one of the engineers remarked, glancing up at the ceiling, where a faded painting depicted angels among clouds. Alexander nodded but said nothing. His attention was drawn to something he had noticed on his last visit. Now, it seemed even more striking. Several windows on the second floor were latched from the inside. "Strange," he muttered. "Did you say something, sir?" one of the workers asked. "Number nothing," Alexander replied, though his mind raced with questions. If the house had been abandoned for years, who had locked those windows? As the team worked downstairs, Alexander ventured alone to explore the upper floor. He opened door after door, finding furniture draped in dusty sheets and empty wardrobes. But as he entered a room at the end of the hall, something caught his attention. The air in the room felt different, heavier. It was a small space with an iron bed pushed against one wall and a window partly ajar. On the floor lay an old, neatly folded blanket, a small flashlight, and some discarded food wrappers. Alexander crouched to inspect the items, his heartbeat quickening. Who was here? He wondered. Suddenly, a faint noise made him freeze. It was a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like something, or someone moving upstairs. Alexander rose slowly and followed the sound, his stomach twisting with unease. He climbed the staircase leading to the attic, each step creaking under his weight. At the top, he found a door slightly ajar. Pushing it gently, he stepped into the dim, dusty space. Before he could investigate, hurried footsteps echoed behind him. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice reverberating. There was no reply, just the sound of footsteps rushing back down the hallway. Alexander descended quickly, but when he reached the ground floor, silence had returned. He looked around, searching for something, or someone, that could explain what had just happened. The next day, Alexander returned to the mansion with his friend Mike, a restorer experienced in handling old properties. He recounted the strange sounds and what he had seen, but Mike merely chuckled, dismissing it as Alexander's imagination. "Old houses like this always have weird noises," Mike said, examining the intricate carvings on a wooden staircase. "Probably just the wind or some animal." Alexander wasn't convinced but decided to drop the subject for the time being. He continued exploring the upper floors, paying closer attention this time. Passing through the same room where he'd found the blanket, he noticed something new, a piece of paper caught beneath a piece of furniture. Picking it up, he found it crumpled and dusty but still legible. It was a child's drawing, made with colored pencils. It depicted a little girl holding a baby, with what appeared to be the mansion in the background. Alexander furrowed his brow. "This can't be," he muttered to himself. That night, sleep eluded him as his mind raced with thoughts of the drawing, the blanket, and the sounds he'd heard. One thing was clear, the house wasn't as abandoned as he had thought. The following day, Alexander decided to investigate on his own. He returned to the mansion in the late afternoon, after the renovation crew had left. With a flashlight in hand, he wandered the hallways in silence, examining every detail. When he reached the attic again, the air felt as heavy as it had the previous day. Then he saw something that made him freeze. In a shadowy corner of the attic, partially obscured, was a small figure. A girl, no older than 10, stared at him with wide, frightened eyes. "Hello," Alexander said, lowering his flashlight to avoid scaring her. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The girl didn't respond but stepped back slightly, clutching something that looked like a blanket. Alexander took a cautious step forward, moving slowly. "My name is Alexander," he said, trying to sound calm. "What are you doing here?" The girl stared at him for a moment before whispering in a barely audible voice. "I live here. Please, don't send us away," Grace pleaded, her voice trembling. Alexander froze, trying to comprehend what he had just heard. "Us?" he asked, his tone laced with confusion. The girl nodded and pointed behind her. That's when Alexander noticed a baby wrapped in a blanket, peacefully asleep in a makeshift corner of the dusty attic. In that moment, it became clear. This mansion held more than just echoes of the past. He wasn't just dealing with an abandoned property. He was stepping into a mystery that would alter his life forever. Alexander stood still, his eyes shifting between the girl and the baby in the shadowy attic. His flashlight quivered slightly in his grasp, but he steadied himself. There was no doubt now, the children were living there. Alone. In the darkness of this forgotten house. The girl watched him warily, her small figure partially shielded by the blanket she clutched as if it were her armor. The baby remained nestled in the corner, undisturbed by the tense atmosphere. Alexander drew a deep breath and broke the silence. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Grace," the girl whispered, barely audible. Alexander offered a tentative smile, crouching to meet her gaze. "Grace, you don't need to be afraid. I'm here to help." Her lips pressed together as she took a hesitant step back. "Nobody can help us. They all say that, but then they leave. It's always just me, looking after him." "I'm not going anywhere," Alexander said firmly, hoping to reassure her. "But I need to understand what's going on. Are you here alone?" Grace hesitated, glancing at the baby before nodding. "Yes. Just me and Ethan." As Alexander processed the weight of her words, a sudden noise echoed from the corridor below. The metallic clatter sounded sharp, like something had fallen. Grace's eyes widened, and Alexander felt his pulse quicken. Does that happen often?" he asked. Grace nodded slowly. "Sometimes. Always when someone new comes into the house." Alexander wasn't sure what to make of it. Maybe it was just the quirks of the old mansion, its decaying structure playing tricks. Or maybe, just maybe, there was someone or something else here with them. Gripping the flashlight more tightly, he turned to Grace. "Stay here. I'll check it out." "No," Grace exclaimed, grabbing his arm. "Don't go. What if it's someone bad?" The fear in her voice gave Alexander pause. He glanced down the dark hallway and, for a moment, doubted his own decision. But the thought of leaving Grace and Ethan unprotected seemed far worse. "I promise I'll be quick," he assured her, trying to sound confident. Grace reluctantly released his arm, and Alexander descended the stairs, his flashlight casting a faint glow on each creaking step. The sound had come from the first floor, near the main entrance. Moving cautiously, Alexander felt the chill of the night seeping through the broken windows. Reaching the ground floor, he spotted an old metal chair toppled over on the floor. At first glance, it seemed as though it had simply fallen on its own. Maybe it's just the wind, he thought, bending down to get a closer look at the marks. A soft noise echoed behind him, like the faint creak of wooden planks. Alexander spun around quickly, but all he saw were shadows. He started to nod, a cold shiver running down his spine. It was clear that something, or someone, was moving through the house. "If it's someone, you'd better come out, damn it," he shouted, his voice firm. He thought of the strange vibes the place gave him. Grace didn't seem convinced, but she didn't argue. Her silence hung heavy, though she kept glancing away, avoiding his eyes. Alexander tried to make sense of it all. What was going on here? He didn't have answers, but he could feel the tension in his chest. Grace dropped her gaze, evading his as if she carried some unspoken burden. "My mom told me she'd come back, but she didn't." Alexander felt a lump in his throat. It was obvious Grace was struggling to protect her little brother while clinging to a fragile hope. But reality was harsh. He needed to act quickly, but without alarming her. Grace looked at him, her expression wary but determined. Alexander quickly placed Grace and Ethan into his car, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing harder on him. He knew he had to uncover what was truly happening in that ominous house and why two kids were left to survive there alone. As he drove back to the city, his mind raced. The mysteries of the mansion lingered, gnawing at him like an unfinished puzzle. In the silence of the car, Ethan's soft breathing and Grace's quiet murmurs filled the air. She still held her brother tightly, her thin arms wrapping around the baby's small body as if she were his only shield. Alexander glanced at Grace through the rearview mirror, struggling to find the right words. "Are you hungry?" he finally asked, breaking the silence. She hesitated, then nodded. "Ethan needs to eat," she said softly, her voice trembling with concern. "Don't worry, we'll take care of that now," Alexander reassured her, steering toward a restaurant he knew. He told Grace and Ethan to stay in the car while he went inside to grab some food. He understood that the little girl still didn't fully trust him and didn't want to push her into dealing with a crowd of strangers. When he returned with a bag of food, Grace was sitting stiffly, her body tense as if bracing for something bad to happen. "Eat up," Alexander said gently, handing her the bag. "There's milk for Ethan too." Grace carefully opened the bag, handling it as if she were afraid of damaging something inside. She pulled out a small sandwich and began eating it slowly, her eyes cautiously studying Alexander. She seemed to analyze every move he made, trying to determine if he could be trusted. Ethan began shifting in Grace's lap, letting out a faint whimper. She quickly grabbed the bottle of milk Alexander had brought and started feeding him. The baby clutched the bottle with his tiny hands, drinking with such urgency that it tugged at Alexander's heart. "You take good care of him," he remarked softly, offering a gentle smile. "He's my brother," Grace replied, as though that explained everything. Once Grace and Ethan had finished eating, Alexander decided it was time to ask more direct questions. He needed to understand what had happened and why these children were alone in that mansion. "Grace," he began carefully, "you said your mother promised to come back. What happened exactly?" Grace lowered her eyes, her fingers nervously fidgeting with the edge of Ethan's blanket. "She brought us there because she didn't have anywhere else to go," she finally said. "She said the house belonged to someone she knew, and we'd be safe there. But then she left to get food and didn't come back." Alexander felt a lump form in his throat. "How long ago was that?" "I don't know," Grace said, shaking her head. "Maybe weeks." Her response made his concern deepen. He knew he had to act quickly. "Grace, I want to help you, but I need to know more about your mother. Do you know where she might be? Anyone she knows, or places she might visit often?" Grace shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "She didn't talk much about that," she whispered. She only said she was trying to find work, but she always looked so sad. Alexander realized there were no simple answers here. He had no idea where to start looking for the children's mother, but one thing was clear: Grace and Ethan needed a safe place to stay until he could figure out what to do. "You'll stay with me?" he said firmly. Grace's eyes widened in surprise. "Stay with you? Why?" "Because you need a safe place," he replied with conviction. "And I promise I won't leave you alone." She looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to believe his words. Finally, she gave a hesitant nod. When they arrived at Alexander's apartment, Grace looked visibly uneasy. The space was large and modern, filled with sleek furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking views of the city. To her, it was a world completely removed from the cold, damp basement where she and Ethan had spent the last few weeks. "Make yourselves at home," Alexander said, guiding her toward the sofa. "I'll prepare a room for you." Grace sat down cautiously, still holding Ethan tightly, as though bracing for something unexpected to happen at any moment. Alexander felt a pang in his chest at how guarded she was. He knew earning her trust would be a slow process. Later, when he returned with a clean blanket and some new clothes he had stored away, he found Grace asleep on the sofa, Ethan curled up in her arms. Alexander paused for a moment, taking in the scene before him. He had never felt such a sense of responsibility for someone else before. Although he was a man used to making critical decisions and leading entire teams, nothing in his past had prepared him for this. Yet, as he looked at Grace and Ethan asleep on his couch, he knew he had made the right choice. Watching the two children resting peacefully, a new determination took hold of him. Alexander understood that protecting Grace and Ethan was just the beginning of a journey, one that would uncover mysteries about their mother and that eerie mansion far beyond anything he could have imagined. What he didn't know yet was that his decision to help these kids would lead him to a secret that would alter his life forever. When the morning sunlight spilled into the apartment, Alexander woke up early, resolved to show Grace and Ethan that they could trust him. He had spent much of the night discreetly researching shelters and social services, yet one thought lingered. Handing them off to someone else didn't feel like the right solution. As he prepared breakfast, the sound of small footsteps caught his attention. Grace stood in the hallway, holding Ethan in her arms. Her eyes were red, as if she had cried all night, but there was still a defiant air about her. "Good morning," Alexander said softly. Grace gave a small nod but remained silent. "I've made something for you," he continued, gesturing to the table. "Come sit here." Grace hesitated but eventually approached. She placed Ethan in a makeshift chair Alexander had set up and sat down, her gaze fixed warily on his every move. Alexander served a plate of toast, fruit, and a glass of juice for Grace, along with a bottle of milk for Ethan. "I wasn't sure what you like, so I kept it simple," he said with a gentle smile. Grace eyed the plate cautiously, as if struggling to believe it was really for her. After a few seconds, she began to eat, slowly and in silence. Alexander seized the moment to try starting a conversation. He knew gaining Grace's trust was crucial to helping them. As they sat there, he couldn't shake the weight of their situation. He had no blueprint for this, no manual to follow. But something about the determination in Grace's posture and the vulnerability in Ethan's tiny hands sparked a resolve in him to do whatever it took. Alexander began sketching out a routine for their days ahead, organizing a life for the three of them that felt more like a family than a stopgap. Compelling toys for Grace and Ethan, even a small table where Grace could draw or write, sat in the sunlight-drenched room as Alexander worked on sorting papers. Lost in thought at the desk, he let out a sigh, his mind preoccupied with the children's well-being. "Kids deserve stability," he murmured. That single thought ignited a flicker of determination in him. Alexander decided to give the children a taste of normalcy and took them to a nearby park. Grace seemed hesitant at first, her body language guarded, but gradually she relaxed as she watched other kids play. Ethan babbled happily in Alexander's arms while Grace observed the children on the swings with a distant expression. "Did you used to play in parks?" Alexander asked gently. "Yes, before." Grace began but trailed off, struggling to finish the thought. "Before your mom brought you to the mansion?" he prompted softly. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "She always said things would get better, but they didn't. I just wish she was here now." "I know, Grace. I promise I'll do everything I can to help you and Ethan," Alexander said firmly. For the first time, Grace's eyes held something beyond distrust, a flicker of hope. Alexander realized he was beginning to earn her trust, but he also knew this was only the start. To truly help them, he needed to understand what had happened to their mother and uncover the secrets of the mansion. Back at the apartment, Alexander couldn't shake thoughts of Grace's story and the eerie mansion where he'd found her. What could drive a mother to abandon her children in such a grim and dangerous place? And why did that house feel so shrouded in mystery? That evening, after tucking Ethan into bed and watching Grace curl up on the couch with a book, Alexander resolved to seek answers. He opened his laptop and began researching the mansion. The initial findings were mundane. A historic property built by an aristocratic family in the late 19th century, later sold multiple times and eventually abandoned after a partial fire. But on a local history site, he stumbled upon something more intriguing. Rumors suggested the mansion was steeped in family disputes and unresolved secrets. Some neighbors claimed it brought misfortune, while others spoke of strange lights and voices lingering long after it was abandoned. Superstitions, Alexander muttered to himself, but deep down, he knew there was more to uncover. Alexander knew deep down it wasn't just that. Grace and Ethan were living proof that something deeper was happening in that house, something waiting to be uncovered. The next morning, as Grace sipped her coffee and Ethan played on the carpet, Alexander decided to give it another try. He could feel Grace starting to trust him, but there was still so much she was keeping from him. Grace glanced at her plate, avoiding his gaze. She said it was the only safe place. That no one would ever find them there. Did she explain why she thought that? Was there a connection to the house? Grace hesitated before answering. She admitted she knew the house, that she'd been there before. Grace already knew the house, which made Alexander wonder if there was more to the story than he'd imagined. And you? Have you been there before? He asked. Grace shook her head. No, it was my first time. But somehow, it felt familiar. That's why I decided to return. Alexander knew it wasn't safe to bring Grace and Ethan back. So he turned to a trusted friend, Emily, to watch over them while he made another trip. Are you sure you want to go back there alone? Emily asked, concerned. I have to, Alexander replied. There's something in that house, something directly tied to these children. I need to understand what it is. When he reached the mansion, it looked even more abandoned than before. The wind blew through shattered windows, sending the tattered curtains flapping like silent ghosts. Flashlight in hand, Alexander stepped inside to explore the rooms once more. This time, he noticed things he'd missed before. Small scratches on the walls, objects that seemed recently moved. In one room, he discovered a worn, old notebook tucked under a pile of aged clothing. Carefully, Alexander opened it, realizing it was a diary. As he read the first pages, a chill ran down his spine. The words were disjointed, but there was something hauntingly personal about them, as though the writer had been desperate to capture their thoughts before it was too late. One sketch stood out. A woman holding two children, with the mansion looming in the background. Beneath the drawing, a cryptic note read, "Everything is connected." Alexander shut the notebook, his heart racing. He didn't know exactly what it meant, but it was clear the mansion held far more secrets than he'd anticipated. Back at the apartment, Alexander found Grace playing with Ethan. He hesitated to tell her what he'd found, afraid to scare her, but he knew he had to be honest. Sitting beside her, he said, I found something in the mansion. A notebook. I think it might have belonged to your mother or someone who was there before. Grace's eyes widened. What did it say? I'm still piecing it together, Alexander replied. But it mentioned fear, secrets, and there was a drawing, one that looked a lot like yours. Grace sat quietly for a moment before speaking. My mother used to say the mansion was important. That there was something there that could save us. Alexander felt the weight of her words. If the mansion had been so significant to Grace's mother, maybe the answers to everything lay hidden there. Yet the more Alexander delved into the mystery, the more he realized the mansion wasn't just a place filled with old stories. It was the heart of a puzzle that intertwined his past with Grace and Ethan's future. Here's the rewritten version based on your rules. Deep down, he understood it wasn't just that. Grace and Ethan were proof that something strange was happening in that house, something yet to be uncovered. The next morning, while Grace sipped her coffee and Ethan played on the rug, Alexander decided to try again. He could tell Grace was beginning to trust him, but there was still so much she wasn't revealing. Grace looked down at her plate, avoiding his gaze. She said it was the only safe place. That no one would find them there. Did she mention why she thought that? Was there some connection to the house? Grace hesitated before replying. She said she knew the house, that she'd been there before. But Grace already being familiar with the house suggested there was more to the story than he'd realized. And you? Had you been there before? Grace shook her head. No, it was my first time. but it felt familiar in a strange way. Like it was calling me back. Alexander knew it wouldn't be safe to bring Grace and Ethan along. So he asked a trusted friend, Emily, to watch over them while he went back to the house. "Are you sure you want to go back there alone?" Emily asked, concerned. "I have to," Alexander replied. "There's something in that house that ties directly to these kids. I need to figure out what it is." When he reached the mansion, the place looked even more desolate than before. The wind howled through the broken windows, making the tattered curtains ripple like silent ghosts. Flashlight in hand, Alexander stepped inside and began to search the rooms again. This time, he noticed things he'd missed before. Small scratches on the walls, objects that seemed recently disturbed. In one of the rooms, he found an old, tattered notebook hidden under a pile of aged clothes. Carefully, Alexander opened it and realized it was a diary. The first few pages gave him chills. The words didn't make much sense, but there was something hauntingly personal about them. It felt as if the writer had been desperate to record their thoughts before it was too late. One page contained a drawing, a woman holding 2 children, with the mansion in the background. Beneath the sketch, the words "everything is connected" were written. Alexander shut the diary, his heart racing. He didn't know exactly what it meant, but it was clear the mansion held more secrets than he'd imagined. Back at the apartment, Alexander found Grace playing with Ethan. He hesitated to tell her what he'd found, worried it might scare her, but he knew he had to be honest. "Grace," he said, sitting beside her. "I found something in the mansion, a notebook. I think it might have belonged to your mother, or someone who was there before." Grace's eyes widened. "What did it say?" "I'm still trying to figure it out," he replied. "But it mentioned fear, secrets, and there was a drawing. It looked like one of yours." Grace fell silent for a moment before responding. "My mother used to say the mansion was important, that something there could save us." Alexander felt the weight of her words. If the mansion had been so significant to Grace's mother, then maybe the key to everything lay within its walls. But the deeper Alexander delved, the more he realized that the mansion wasn't just a place filled with old stories. It was the center of a mystery, tying his past to Grace and Ethan's future. And it could change their lives forever. Alexander knew he had reached a pivotal moment. The fragments he had uncovered, the diary, Grace's sketches, and her words, pointed to a deeper mystery involving the mansion and the children's mother. But Alexander also understood Grace and Ethan couldn't wait endlessly. A decision needed to be made. He had to ensure their safety while seeking answers. That evening, as Grace tucked Ethan into bed, Alexander sat in the living room, staring at the diary he'd brought from the mansion. He had read it several times, but it always felt like something was slipping through his grasp. What exactly did "everything is connected" mean? Grace's voice broke through his thoughts. "What are you going to do with us?" she asked, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed. Alexander looked up at her, realizing the weight of her question. She wasn't just asking about the present. She wanted to know if there was a secure future for herself and her brother. "I've decided you'll both stay with me," he said with determination. Grace looked startled by his response. "Stay with you? But what if my mother comes back?" "If your mother returns, I promise we'll find her. But until then, I want to make sure you're safe," Alexander assured her. Grace studied him for a moment, trying to determine if she could trust his words. Finally, she nodded. "All right. But what about Ethan? Will he be okay?" "I'll do everything I can to take care of both of you," Alexander replied earnestly. In the following days, Alexander began adjusting his life to accommodate Grace and Ethan. He hired an experienced nanny to help with the baby while he worked and prepared a special room for Grace. He decorated it with soft colors and simple yet cozy furniture that seemed to suit her style. When Grace saw the room for the first time, she stood frozen at the doorway, unsure of what to say. "Is this for me?" she finally asked. "Yes," Alexander said. "This is your space now. I hope you like it." Grace gave a small smile that quickly faded. "I've never had a room of my own before," she murmured, almost as if she were apologizing. Alexander knelt beside her. "Now you have one. And you'll always have it as long as I'm here." While Alexander focused on creating a secure environment for the children, Grace started to open up more. She began to share small glimpses of her past, moments of joy with her mother, the struggles they faced together, and the dreams she used to hold before everything fell apart. "My mom always said that one day we'd have a real home," Grace mentioned one evening as Alexander helped Ethan eat. "Now you do," he replied with a smile. But despite the progress, Alexander knew there was still much to uncover. Grace's mother was still missing, and the mystery surrounding the mansion continued to weigh on him. He understood he couldn't offer Grace and Ethan true peace until all the pieces of the puzzle were brought to light. One afternoon, as Alexander was beginning to believe progress was being made, Grace received a letter. It had been left at the apartment door. A letter? From who? He asked, feeling his pulse quicken. I don't know. It's handwritten and looks old, Grace replied, her voice tinged with uncertainty. But I think I recognize the handwriting. I think it's my mom's. Alexander felt a rush of conflicting emotions. On one hand, the letter might finally provide a clue to Grace's mother's whereabouts. On the other, he feared what the letter might contain. I'm coming home now, he said, ending the call. When he arrived at the apartment, he found Grace clutching the letter, her hands trembling. Ethan was asleep in his crib, and Emily was nearby, trying to comfort her. Let me see, Alexander said, reaching out. Grace hesitated for a moment before handing him the letter. Alexander carefully opened the envelope and began to read. Dear Grace, I'm so sorry for leaving you and Ethan. It was the hardest decision I've ever made, but I had no other choice. I promise everything I did was to protect you both. The mansion holds answers you don't yet understand, but Alexander can help. Trust him. He knows more about this house than you realize. With love, Mom. Alexander froze, rereading the words again. Grace's mother knew who he was, and what he knows more than you realize, truly meant. Grace stared at him, her eyes brimming with questions. What does this mean? I don't know, Alexander replied, still trying to process the letter's contents. But I'm going to find out. Holding the letter tightly, Alexander realized he was far more entangled in this mystery than he ever anticipated. Grace's mother, the mansion, and now himself. It all seemed interconnected. What Alexander didn't yet understand was that the next piece of the puzzle was about to reveal itself, bringing a truth he wasn't ready to face. He spent the night poring over the letter left at the door. Each word echoed in his mind. How did Grace's mother know so much about him? Why did she trust him to help, even though they had never met? The questions multiplied, but the answers stayed maddeningly out of reach. The next day, Alexander decided to act. He returned to the mansion, carrying the diary he had found, the letter, and an unyielding resolve to uncover the truth. This wasn't just a property to explore anymore, it was something personal, woven into his life. Inside the mansion, Alexander began searching every room, paying attention to details he had missed before. In the attic, where he'd found Grace and Ethan, he noticed a hidden staircase behind a false wall. Pushing it with all his strength, he managed to open the entryway, revealing a secret room. The room was cramped and suffocating, filled with old boxes and dust-covered furniture. But what drew his attention most was a stack of documents on a table. Alexander grabbed the papers, realizing they included property records, personal letters, and vintage photographs. As he sifted through the papers, he found something that took his breath away. A photograph of his own family, a portrait of his grandparents taken in the 1940s, standing in front of the very same mansion. This isn't possible, Alexander muttered, his heart pounding. He rummaged through the papers with growing urgency and found a letter signed by his grandfather, mentioning a partnership with the mansion's former owner. It appeared the house had been used as a storage site for valuable goods during the Spanish Civil War. But what began as a relationship built on trust had spiraled into a bitter feud between the two families. That explains why my family never talked about this house, Alexander thought. Back at the apartment, Alexander shared what he had uncovered with Grace. He showed her the photograph and explained his family's connection to the mansion. Grace asked cautiously, "So, you already knew about the house?" Alexander hesitated. "Not exactly," he replied. "My family never talked about it, but it seems the mansion has a tangled past. And somehow, you and Ethan are caught up in it." Grace held Ethan close, staying quiet for a moment before asking, "Do you think that's why my mom brought us there? Because of your family?" Alexander didn't have an answer but knew he had to dig deeper. The following week, Alexander hired a historian who specialized in old estates to decipher the documents he had found. The historian, a man named James, spent hours poring over the papers. Eventually, he uncovered something Alexander had overlooked. A reference to a hidden chest within the mansion. It supposedly contained financial records and letters that could shed light on past events. And maybe even explain how Grace's mother knew so much about it, James added. Alexander felt a mix of excitement and dread. He knew he had to return to the mansion to find the chest, But he also feared what he might uncover. 2 nights later, Alexander returned to the mansion, equipped with tools to open the chest. Following the directions in the document, he discovered it hidden behind the fireplace in the main hall. After considerable effort, he managed to open it. Inside were financial records tied to the original construction of the house, detailing an association the previous owner had formed. But the most disturbing find was a diary written by that owner. It described events leading to accusations of betrayal and collapse, and hinted that Grace's mother had uncovered something dangerous. Letters suggested she knew too much about financial disputes and concealed assets in the mansion and had been forced to flee. Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. Grace's mother hadn't taken her children to the mansion by chance. She believed it held something that could protect them. Back at the apartment, Alexander told Grace everything. He explained the connection between his family and the mansion, the chest, and what he had learned about her mother. Grace listened intently before quietly saying, "She did it to protect us. She knew the mansion was a place where no one would find us." She paused, then asked hesitantly, "Do you think she's still alive?" Alexander met her gaze, seeing the mix of hope and fear in her eyes. "I don't know, but we'll keep looking. At least now we have a starting point." With the newfound information, Alexander knew they were getting closer to the truth. But he also realized that finding Grace's mother meant uncovering not just his family's past but secrets he'd never imagined. In the days that followed, Alexander felt the weight of these revelations. There was something deeply personal tying him to Grace and Ethan. The link between his family and the mansion was unsettling, but the involvement of Grace's mother made the mystery even more complex. One afternoon, as Grace sketched on the couch and Ethan played with his toys, Alexander resolved to confront what was unfolding. The answers they sought were no longer just about the past. They were about the future they hoped to build together. Grace began by sitting beside him. "Do you remember anything your mother might have said about my family? Any story, maybe a name?" She stopped drawing, gripping the pencil tightly. "My mom never mentioned you, but she did talk about the mansion, like it was special. She said there was something there that would protect us." "And do you know what it was?" Grace shook her head. "She only said she was scared. Before taking us there, she cried a lot. I think she was trying to figure out what to do." Alexander placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I promise you, we're going to uncover the truth. And in the meantime, I'll be here for you both." That evening, while Alexander was putting Ethan to bed, Grace appeared at the doorway. She was holding a piece of paper, another drawing. But this time, it was different from the others. It was a scene of the mansion with 3 figures, a woman, a girl, and a man. "Did you draw this?" Alexander asked, intrigued. Grace nodded. "I dreamed about it. I think it's my mom, me, and you." Alexander remained silent, studying the drawing. He didn't know how to interpret it, but a shiver ran down his spine. Somehow, it felt like he had been a part of Grace and Ethan's story long before meeting them. The next day, Alexander decided to return to the documents he had discovered in the chest. He knew he had to examine every detail to find a connection to Grace's mother's story. As he read, he came across a letter written by his grandfather, referencing a woman named Catherine. The same name as Grace's mother. In the letter, his grandfather mentioned that Catherine was the one who could protect them. This isn't a coincidence, Alexander thought. My family and theirs have been connected for generations. Back at the apartment, Alexander shared his findings with Grace. He explained his grandfather's letter and how Catherine seemed to know the mansion's secrets. "So my mom knew about your family?" Grace asked, her eyes wide. "It seems she did," Alexander replied. "And she trusted the mansion as a safe place. But we still don't know why." Grace was quiet for a moment before saying, "She trusted you, Alexander. My mom would have trusted you too." Those words struck something deep within him. He realized he wasn't just helping these kids. He was mending a story of pain that had spanned generations. For the first time, he understood that the bond he felt with them went far beyond obligation. Alexander began to wonder if fate had brought Grace and Ethan into his life for a bigger purpose. "They're not just children I'm helping," he thought. "They're my family now." What he didn't realize yet was that his search for answers was about to lead him to a direct confrontation with his own family's past and an earth-shattering truth that would change his life forever. He became increasingly convinced that Grace and Ethan's story was intertwined with his in ways he couldn't yet fully grasp. But one thing was clear. He no longer saw them as a burden or a temporary responsibility. They were part of his life now, and he would do whatever it took to protect them. Over the following months, Alexander's routine shifted dramatically. He spent less time at work, and his focus turned to building a life with the children. He enrolled Grace in a nearby school, where she quickly stood out as a curious and creative student. Her talent for drawing caught everyone's attention, and Alexander nurtured her passion, buying art supplies and even setting up a space where she could paint and sketch. Ethan, on the other hand, was growing quickly, healthy and full of energy. Alexander immersed himself in learning how to care for the baby, from changing diapers to soothing him on the toughest nights. It was exhausting but deeply rewarding. "You're good at this?" Grace said one evening as she watched Alexander rock Ethan to sleep. "I'm learning," he replied with a smile. Grace returned a faint smile, but her eyes carried a mix of gratitude and sadness. One night, as Alexander helped Grace pack her school bag, she sat quietly on the bed before finally speaking. "I remember something," she said suddenly. Alexander looked up, surprised. "About what?" "About my mom," Grace replied. "Before she took us to the mansion, I overheard her on the phone. She said she was going to leave something important there, something that had to stay hidden." Alexander felt his heart tighten. "Do you know what it was?" Grace shook her head. "No, but she said it was to protect me and Ethan." This revelation sparked a new wave of questions. Alexander knew he needed to return to the mansion to uncover what Anna had left behind. The next morning, Alexander drove back to the mansion, this time with Grace by his side. He had a feeling they might find something significant, and he wanted her there to help identify anything important. As they arrived, Grace appeared nervous but determined. She gripped Alexander's hand tightly as they walked through the dim hallways. "It's here," she said, stopping in front of a door Alexander had not yet explored. Inside the room was only an old dresser and some cardboard boxes. Alexander began sifting through the boxes while Grace stood by, watching intently. After a few minutes, she found a small trunk locked tight. "This is it?" Grace whispered, her voice barely audible. Alexander used a tool to pry open the trunk. Inside, there was a collection of documents, including records, letters, and a photo of Catherine holding Grace and Ethan. But what caught Alexander's eye the most was a letter addressed to him. It was from Catherine. In the letter, she explained that she had uncovered something about the old conflict between Alexander's family and the original owner of the mansion. According to Catherine, Alexander's family had stored valuable items in the house, but those possessions had been seized under questionable circumstances. Catherine believed that something in the mansion's records might prove the injustice and provide a way to secure a future for Grace and Ethan. At the end of the letter, Catherine made an even more shocking confession. Alexander and Grace shared a family bond. Alexander's grandfather had secretly been involved with Catherine's grandmother. It was something she had only just discovered. "I am part of your family," the letter concluded. Grace furrowed her brow, confused. "What do you mean?" Alexander carefully explained everything, choosing simple words to help her understand. When he finished, Grace remained silent before saying, "You are my family, Alexander. You always will be." Over the following months, Alexander dedicated his life to ensuring Grace and Ethan had a bright future. He finalized the official adoption of the children, making sure they would never again have to worry about their safety or stability. Grace continued to excel in school, with Alexander encouraging her to chase her dream of becoming an artist. Ethan grew into a happy, energetic boy who filled the house with laughter. On Grace's birthday, Alexander threw a small party with her new friends from school. During the celebration, she handed him a gift. It was a drawing of herself, Ethan, and Alexander, with the word family written in large letters across the top. Alexander felt tears well up in his eyes. "You gave us everything," Grace said with a smile. "No," he replied, his voice filled with emotion. "You gave me everything." The mansion, once a symbol of mystery and pain, was now simply part of a bigger story. A story of how Alexander found a new purpose and how Grace and Ethan found a home. In the end, Alexander realized true wealth wasn't in material possessions but in the bonds we create and the lives we touch. The once quiet mansion transformed into a place filled with love, laughter, and hope, a home where everyone could finally begin anew.
Brother kicked me out over sister-in-law's lies. Now they're homeless and want to move into my house. All right, I guess I need to get this off my chest. A few years ago, I was really struggling. I had just finished college, had a not-so-great job, and honestly, life wasn't looking too good for me. My older brother, Tom, who's 9 years older than me, offered me a place to stay with him and his wife, Karen. At the time, I was super grateful. I mean, who wouldn't be? Rent was ridiculously high, and I wasn't making enough to even consider living on my own. Tom had this nice house with a spare room, and he told me I could stay there as long as I needed until I got back on my feet. It felt like a lifeline. So I moved in with them. It wasn't a permanent solution, but I was trying to get myself together, you know? I didn't want to be a burden or anything, so I made sure I helped out around the house as much as possible. I did the cooking, cleaning, ran errands, all that stuff. I wasn't contributing much financially at first because I could barely afford my own groceries, but I pitched in whenever I could. Like if I had some extra cash, I'd buy groceries for the house or take care of the little things they needed. I thought it was going pretty well. At first, everything seemed fine. Karen was nice enough, and Tom and I have always been close, so it felt like I was in a safe place. Karen and I weren't best friends or anything, but I didn't think there was any problem between us. She never really said much, just kind of kept to herself, but I didn't take it personally. She was pregnant at the time, so I figured she just had her own stuff going on, but after about 6 months, things started getting weird. Like, subtle stuff at first. Karen would make these little comments like, oh, when the baby comes, we're going to need a lot more space. Or, I wonder if we should start thinking about how to turn the guest room into a nursery. You know, hints like that. I kind of got the vibe that she wanted me gone, but Tom kept reassuring me, saying, don't worry about it. You can stay as long as you need. I believed him because, well, he's my brother. Why would I think otherwise, right? Then the comments got less subtle. Karen started complaining more openly, saying things like, it's going to be really hard having a newborn and a third person in the house. I wasn't trying to overstay my welcome, but at the same time, I didn't have anywhere else to go just yet. I had finally gotten a decent job by this point, but it wasn't like I had enough saved up to just pack my bags and leave right away. One day things really started to shift. I remember it clear as day. Karen was sitting in the living room, and I was in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner. Tom wasn't home yet, and Karen just starts talking to me out of nowhere. She tells me that she's uncomfortable with me living there, that it's affecting her peace of mind, and how she doesn't feel safe with some of the people I hang out with. I was like, what people? Because I barely went out, and when I did, it was usually with coworkers or old friends from college. Karen goes, you know, I heard from Tom that some of your friends are involved in stuff like drugs, and I don't want that around my baby. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I'm not even close to anyone involved in that kind of crap, and I told her that. But she just shrugged like she knew something I didn't. I remember feeling like my stomach dropped because it was so out of left field, but I figured she was just stressed out with the pregnancy and all. I tried to brush it off, but things didn't stop there. After that conversation, Karen got colder. She'd give me these looks, like I was in her way, and barely spoke to me unless it was to drop more passive-aggressive hints about me leaving. I knew something was off, but I didn't want to believe that she'd straight up make things up about me. I mean, it's my brother's wife. What reason would she have to lie? Well, fast forward a couple of weeks, and Tom starts acting distant too. It's not like him, so I asked him one night if everything was okay, and he just said Karen's been really stressed lately. He didn't bring up anything specific, but the vibe was off. Like, it felt like he was hiding something, but I didn't push him on it. So when Karen started acting a bit more distant, I didn't think much of it. I figured she just needed space or was going through her own stuff. But then, she started making these comments. Little things that, in hindsight, were probably meant to push me out without actually saying it outright. Like, she'd mention how small the house felt all of a sudden, or how she needed more room for the baby's stuff. There was one time she even joked, maybe you'll be moving out before the baby comes, right? And then laughed it off like it was no big deal. I remember laughing with her, but deep down I was like, wait, is she serious? It wasn't just the comments, though. She started avoiding me more. If I was in the living room, she'd go upstairs or into another room. I'd try to make conversation, ask her about the pregnancy, if she needed anything, and she'd just brush me off. I was starting to feel like a ghost in the house. The weird part was that Tom never seemed to notice. He was so wrapped up in the baby stuff, planning for the future, that he didn't see what was happening right in front of him. And then there was the day Karen dropped the bomb about me supposedly flirting with her. I still can't wrap my head around it. It was a regular Tuesday. Tom was at work and I had the day off, so I figured I'd do some cleaning around the house. You know, help out since I was staying there for free. Karen was sitting in the living room just scrolling through her phone, not really paying attention to anything. I was in the kitchen wiping down the counters when she suddenly called out, "Can I talk to you for a second?" I walked over thinking she needed help with something, but the look on her face was just weird. She didn't seem upset, but there was something off about her expression, like she was about to drop some serious news on me. So, she started fiddling with her phone. I've noticed that I don't know how to say this, but you've been acting kinda flirty with me. I literally froze. I didn't even know what to say at first because it was so out of left field. Like what? Me? Flirting? With her? I laughed, thinking she was joking. Wait, what? Flirty? With you? That's crazy, Karen. But she wasn't laughing. She just stared at me, dead serious. No, I'm not kidding. Tom mentioned it to me too. He said he noticed it a while back. That's when the pit in my stomach dropped. Tom noticed it? What the hell was she even talking about? I had never, and I mean never, thought of Karen that way. She was my brother's wife, for crying out loud. The idea of flirting with her was insane. Karen, I don't know what you're talking about, I said, trying to stay calm. I wouldn't. That's not. But she cut me off. Look, I'm just telling you what I feel. And honestly, it's making me uncomfortable. I don't think it's a good idea for you to be here anymore, especially with the baby coming. I felt like the room was spinning. I didn't know how to respond. How do you defend yourself against something that never even happened? I wanted to scream, but I just stood there, completely blindsided. Tom said that? I finally managed to ask. She nodded, but something about the way she did it felt off. Like she wasn't telling the whole story, but I didn't know what part of it was missing. The rest of that conversation is kind of a blur. Karen kept talking about how it's not personal and it's just for the safety of the family, but all I heard was that she wanted me gone. The whole flirting thing was complete BS, but I didn't know how to prove it. And the fact that she claimed Tom noticed it too, that hurt the most. My own brother thought I was hitting on his wife. It didn't make any sense. After that day, things got real tense in the house. Karen stopped talking to me altogether, and Tom acted like everything was fine, but I knew he knew something was up. I tried to talk to him about it one night, but he just brushed me off, saying, Karen's been really stressed with the pregnancy. Don't take it personally. Don't take it personally? How could I not take it personally when his wife was accusing me of something so ridiculous? It got worse when Karen started telling Tom that I was involved with bad people. She told him that some of my friends were into drugs, and that she didn't feel comfortable having me around the baby if I was bringing that kind of influence into their home. I barely even had friends over. I didn't have a social life because I was working and saving up to move out. But somehow, Karen had convinced Tom that I was hanging out with sketchy people. I don't know if Tom actually believed her, or if he just didn't want to deal with the drama, but he started acting weird around me too. He'd come home from work and barely say a word to me, like I wasn't even there. It was obvious Karen had gotten into his head, but every time I tried to bring it up, he'd shut me down. Just give Karen some space, he'd say. She's going through a lot right now. It didn't matter what I said. Karen had already made up her mind and she was doing everything she could to push me out. And the worst part? She was using my brother to do it. It was like watching someone build a case against you for something you didn't even do, and you're just standing there, powerless to stop it. By this point, I knew I couldn't stay there much longer. I was already looking for apartments, but with the rent prices, it wasn't easy. I didn't have a lot of options, and the last thing I wanted was to end up on the streets. I was trying so hard to be patient, to not rock the boat, but deep down I knew it was only a matter of time before Karen made her final move. And when she did, I wasn't sure if Tom would have my back or if he'd side with her. So it finally happened. I knew it was coming, but when it did, it still hit me like a ton of bricks. Karen had been building up to this for weeks, and I guess I was just holding on to hope that Tom would step in and tell her to cut the crap. But, yeah, that didn't happen. I had just gotten home from work, another long day at my new job, and all I wanted to do was relax for a bit. I walked in the door and everything seemed quiet. Too quiet, actually. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like something's off, but you can't put your finger on it right away. I headed towards my room, and that's when I saw it. All my stuff. My clothes, books, random belongings, packed up in boxes and bags, just sitting there in the hallway like trash waiting to be taken out. I stopped in my tracks. My heart started racing, and for a second I thought maybe there was some mistake. Maybe Karen was doing some weird cleaning thing, or I don't know. Maybe Tom was rearranging stuff. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. This wasn't some misunderstanding. I walked into the living room, and there was Tom, sitting on the couch with his head in his hands. He didn't look at me at first, didn't say anything either, just sat there in this awkward silence. Karen was nowhere to be found, of course, leaving him to do the dirty work. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though I could feel my anger bubbling up. Tom sighed, finally looking up at me with this guilty expression, like he was a little kid who got caught doing something wrong. "Karen, she thinks it's time for you to move out," he said. His voice was so quiet, like he was ashamed of even saying it. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Are you serious? You're kicking me out just like that? After everything?" He didn't even try to defend himself. He just nodded, looking at the floor. "It's not like that," he mumbled. It's just, Karen's stressed with the pregnancy and she feels uncomfortable with you being here. You know, with everything going on. Everything going on? What did that even mean? I hadn't done anything wrong. I hadn't caused any problems. All I did was live there, help out, and keep to myself as much as possible. And now I was being thrown out because Karen felt uncomfortable. It was such BS, and Tom knew it too, but he wasn't going to stand up to her. I could see that clearly now. So that's it? You're just throwing me out on the street? I asked, my voice shaking with frustration. Over some lies Karen's been feeding you? I've done nothing but help around here, Tom. You know that. Tom stood up, running a hand through his hair, still avoiding eye contact. I'm not throwing you on the street, he said. I'll help you find a place. We can cover your security deposit, maybe even the first month's rent. It's not like we're abandoning you. Not abandoning me? It felt like the exact opposite. I wasn't asking for money. I was asking for some respect. For my own brother to have my back instead of just rolling over because his wife wanted me gone. Karen said I was flirting with her, Tom. She said I was hanging out with bad people. You really believe that? I asked, desperate for some kind of acknowledgement that he knew the truth. He didn't answer right away, and that silence told me everything I needed to know. He either believed her, or he was too scared to disagree with her. Either way, I was screwed. Look, he finally said, Karen's been really stressed, and with the baby coming, we just need a little more peace in the house. You've been great, and I appreciate everything you've done, but this is what's best for everyone. What's best for everyone? What about what's best for me? I wanted to scream, but I knew it wouldn't make a difference. Karen had made up her mind, and Tom wasn't going to fight her on it. I was being pushed out, and there was nothing I could do to change it. I stood there for a second, trying to process it all. Part of me wanted to just storm out and never look back, but I had nowhere else to go. I didn't have savings for a new place yet, and I definitely didn't have any family I could turn to, at least not after this. Tom was the only one I thought I could count on, and now that bridge was burning right in front of me. When do I have to be out? I asked, my voice flat and defeated. Tom shifted uncomfortably. Karen was hoping by the end of the week, he said, almost like he was ashamed to even say it. The end of the week. That was 4 days away. 4 freaking days to find somewhere to live, pack up my life, and figure out how to survive on my own. Right, I muttered, shaking my head. Thanks for the heads up, I guess. I turned around, heading back to the hallway where all my stuff was piled up. I could feel Tom watching me, but I didn't bother looking back at him. What was the point? He wasn't going to change his mind, and even if he wanted to, Karen wouldn't let him. I started picking up the boxes, dragging them back into my room, trying to figure out what the hell I was going to do next. I spent the next few days frantically searching for apartments, reaching out to anyone I could think of who might be able to let me crash for a while. It wasn't easy. Rent was high, and I didn't have enough saved up yet to afford anything decent. I kept thinking maybe Tom would come to his senses. Maybe he'd talk to Karen and realize how unfair this whole situation was. But every time I saw them together, it was clear that wasn't happening. Karen avoided me completely, barely even acknowledging my existence. And Tom? He was acting like this was all perfectly normal. By the time Friday rolled around, I still hadn't found a place. I was packing the last of my things into boxes, trying not to cry, when Tom knocked on the door. He stood there awkwardly for a minute, holding an envelope in his hand. Here, he said, handing it to me. It's for the security deposit and first month's rent. I hope it helps. I took the envelope without saying anything. I didn't want his money. What I wanted was for my brother to stand up for me, to tell Karen she was wrong, and that I didn't deserve to be treated like this. But that wasn't going to happen, and I knew it. I left that weekend with my boxes and bags, feeling more alone than I ever had before. Tom barely even said goodbye. Karen didn't come out at all. I was just gone, out of their lives like I never mattered in the first place. After getting kicked out of Tom's place, I spent the next few months pretty much in survival mode. I had nowhere to go at first, so I started crashing on friends' couches. You ever feel like you're imposing on people, even when they say it's okay? That's how I felt every single day. I was grateful for my friends letting me stay, but I knew deep down I couldn't keep doing it forever. I was just a guest, and they had their own lives to live. The hardest part was pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. I didn't want to keep bringing up what happened with Tom and Karen. I didn't want people to think I was bitter or stuck on it, but truthfully, I couldn't stop thinking about it. It's not like I could just forget that my own brother tossed me out like I was nothing. But whenever someone asked how I was doing, I just smiled and said, I'm figuring things out, like it wasn't killing me inside. Couch surfing was rough. I couldn't settle anywhere, and I was constantly moving around with all my stuff in boxes and bags. There's something weird about living out of boxes for that long. You feel like you're always on the edge of being thrown out again. I'd pack everything up every time I left for work, just in case. It's like I didn't trust that I'd be welcomed back. It messes with your head living like that. I'll admit, things weren't great for a while. My job was okay, but it didn't pay enough for me to get my own place right away. I was trying to save, but you know how it goes. Every time I thought I was making progress, something would come up that wiped out my savings. Car trouble, bills, groceries. It felt like I was stuck, just treading water and trying not to drown. I thought about calling Tom a few times, asking him for help. But then I'd remember how things ended, and how easily he let Karen push me out. I couldn't go back to him. I couldn't go back to them. The fact that he never even checked on me after I left? That said everything. I wasn't important to him anymore. I was just another problem Karen solved. It's funny, though. You'd think getting thrown out by my own family would have broken me, but somehow it just made me more determined. I decided I wasn't going to rely on anyone else anymore. I was done with people letting me down, done with feeling like I owed anyone for a roof over my head. If I was going to get back on my feet, I was going to do it myself. So I started working harder, picking up extra hours at my job whenever I could. I cut back on everything. No new clothes, no going out, nothing that wasn't necessary. It was tough, but after a few months, I had enough saved up to finally get my own place. It wasn't anything fancy. Just a small one-room studio apartment on the edge of town, but it was mine. No more bouncing from place to place, no more relying on anyone else. I finally had a place to call my own, and it felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I remember the first night in my new apartment. I didn't have much, just a mattress on the floor and a couple of boxes of stuff, but it felt like freedom. It was quiet, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't have to worry about being kicked out. I didn't have to walk on eggshells or tiptoe around anyone's moods. It was just me, and that was enough. Even though I was proud of myself for getting back on my feet, it didn't take away the hurt. I still thought about Tom and Karen all the time. I thought about how easily they tossed me out when they didn't need me anymore. How Karen's lies about me flirting with her and hanging out with sketchy people were enough to convince Tom to kick me out without even giving me a chance to defend myself. It still stung, even if I was doing better. What made it worse was that no one in my family reached out. Not my parents, not my other siblings. It was like I didn't exist anymore. I guess Tom told everyone his side of the story, and I wasn't part of the picture they cared about. My parents always had this thing about keeping the peace, and I'm sure they thought it was easier to let Tom and Karen do whatever they wanted rather than confront them about what happened. But it still hurt, you know? It felt like I'd been erased from their lives, just like that. I focused on moving forward, though. I didn't have time to sit around feeling sorry for myself. I had bills to pay, and the rent wasn't going to take care of itself. So I kept working, kept grinding, and slowly, things started looking up. I got a promotion at work that helped with my finances. I started decorating my little apartment, making it feel like home. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and I was proud of how far I'd come. One thing I learned during all this was that you can't depend on anyone else to fix your life. No one's coming to save you, and the people you think will always have your back might be the ones who push you down the hardest. It's a tough pill to swallow, but it's the truth. You've got to look out for yourself, because when it all comes crashing down, the only person you can count on is you. Still, despite everything, there was a part of me that wished things had gone differently with Tom. I missed having a brother. I missed the way things used to be before Karen came into the picture and flipped everything upside down. But I knew I couldn't go back to that. I couldn't forget how they treated me, and I wasn't going to let them back into my life after what they did. They made their choice, and I had to live with mine. I hadn't spoken to Tom in almost a year by the time I felt like I was back on my feet. Every now and then, I'd get a text from him or Karen asking how I was doing or checking in, but I never responded. I couldn't. Not after what they put me through. I figured they'd moved on, too. They had their baby by now, and I'm sure their life was just fine without me in it. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. You don't just treat family like that and expect everything to be okay. I didn't know it at the time, but that whole situation was going to come back around eventually. And when it did, it was going to change everything. It had been about a year since I got my own place and went completely no contact with Tom and Karen. I'd done everything I could to put them behind me, but it's not like you can just erase family from your mind. Every now and then, I'd think about reaching out, but then I'd remember how they tossed me out like I was nothing. The thought of Tom believing Karen's lies still made me sick. Then, One day I got a call. I was sitting at my desk, half listening to a podcast when my phone started ringing. I glanced at the screen, and to my surprise, it was Tom. We hadn't spoken in almost a year, so seeing his name pop up gave me a weird feeling. Part of me wanted to ignore it, let it go to voicemail, but something told me to pick up. So I did. Hello? I answered, trying to sound neutral, not wanting to show any emotion. There was a pause on the other end, and then Tom's voice came through, sounding different. He didn't sound like the confident, put-together older brother I used to know. He sounded desperate. Hey, he said, it's me. Yeah, I knew it was him. What's up? I replied, not wanting to make this easy for him. Tom hesitated, then sighed. Look, I'm just going to cut to the chase. We need help. Karen and I, we're losing the house. The business went under, and we're getting evicted. We've got nowhere else to go. I could feel my heart rate pick up. I hadn't heard from Tom in over a year, and now he was calling because he needed something? After everything they put me through? It was almost laughable. Part of me wanted to hang up right then and there, let them figure it out on their own. But the other part of me, well, it was complicated. So, what do you want from me? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. We were hoping... He paused, like he didn't even believe what he was about to say. We were hoping you'd let us stay with you, just for a few months, until we get back on our feet. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My mind raced back to that day, coming home to find all my stuff packed in the hallway. The way Tom just stood there while Karen lied about me flirting with her. And now they wanted to stay with me? In my apartment? I let out a short laugh, more out of disbelief than anything. You've got to be kidding me, I said. I know how it sounds, Tom replied quickly, like he knew how ridiculous it was. But we've got 2 kids now. We don't have anywhere else to go. Please, we wouldn't ask if it wasn't an emergency. An emergency. So now I was supposed to forget everything and help them because they were in trouble. Where was that energy when I needed a place to stay? When Karen was throwing me out over lies and Tom just stood by and let it happen? Tom, I don't know what to tell you, I said, keeping my voice steady. You kicked me out when I needed help. Remember that? You and Karen didn't care then. Why should I care now? There was a long silence on the other end of the phone, and for a moment I thought he might hang up. But then he spoke again, and this time his voice was softer, like he was finally starting to get it. I know, he said. I know we screwed up. Karen, she was wrong. I was wrong for not standing up for you. I should have never let that happen. I should have had your back. Hearing him admit that gave me a weird mix of satisfaction and anger. It was the apology I had been waiting for, but it also felt too late. Like it didn't matter anymore. The damage was already done. What good was an apology now after all this time? I needed you, Tom, I said, my voice starting to crack. I needed my brother, and you let her lie about me. You let her make me out to be some kind of freak like I was flirting with her. You believed her over me. I know, he whispered. I'm sorry, I really am. But right now, we're desperate. We don't have anyone else to turn to. I'm asking you, as your brother, please, can we stay with you? I sat there, the phone pressed to my ear, trying to figure out what to say. A part of me wanted to tell him to shove it, to let him deal with the consequences of his choices. But another part of me, maybe the part that still cared about family, despite everything, was torn. I'd been through hell when they kicked me out. But did that mean I had to kick them when they were down too? Was it my responsibility to be the bigger person here? I need some time to think about it, I finally said, my voice tight. I understand, Tom replied, sounding relieved that I hadn't slammed the door in his face just yet. Take as much time as you need. I'm really sorry for everything, and I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me. After we hung up, I just sat there for a while, staring at my phone. Part of me wanted to laugh at the irony of the situation. They threw me out without a second thought, and now they were begging me for a place to stay. It felt like some kind of twisted karmic joke. But the truth was, I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to be that person who holds grudges forever, but at the same time, I didn't want to be walked all over again. If I let them stay, would it just be another situation where they take advantage of me? Or would this be the moment where we all finally grew up and moved past what happened? I thought about it for days. My phone kept buzzing with texts from Tom, reminding me that they didn't have much time left before they had to move out of their house. My parents even got involved, sending me guilt-trippy messages about how family sticks together and how I should let bygones be bygones. But it wasn't that simple. Family sticking together only works when both sides actually give a damn about each other. and for a long time it felt like I was the only one who cared. Update 1. I sat with the phone in my hand, staring at it like it was going to give me some kind of magical answer. After days of thinking about it, I had finally called Tom back. He didn't pick up right away, so I left him a message telling him I had made my decision, and that he could call me back whenever he got the chance. Part of me felt like a huge weight had been lifted, but the other part was just anxious. Like, whatever was going to happen next would either be a huge mess or something that changed everything between us for good. I wasn't sure which way it was going to go, but I had to stick with my choice. About an hour later, Tom called me back. His voice sounded tense, like he had been holding his breath since I left the message. "So, what's your decision?" he asked, not even bothering with small talk. I took a deep breath. "Look, Tom, I thought about it a lot," I started, trying to keep calm, even though I felt like my heart was going to pound out of my chest. "And I can't let you and Karen stay with me." There was silence on the other end, like he wasn't sure he heard me right. "Wait, what? You're serious?" he finally said, sounding more shocked than angry. "After everything, you're really going to turn us away?" "After everything?" I shot back, feeling my voice get sharper. "You mean after you kicked me out of your house with no warning, based on lies Karen made up? You threw me out, Tom. I had nowhere to go. So, yeah, I'm serious." I could hear him breathing on the other end, like he was trying to figure out how to respond without blowing up. "I told you I was sorry for that. We were under a lot of stress. Karen was pregnant and things were just complicated." "Complicated?" I repeated, my frustration boiling over. "You believed lies about me flirting with your wife and hanging out with drug dealers? You didn't even give me a chance to defend myself. And now, because things are bad for you, I'm supposed to just forget about all that?" "I'm not asking you to forget," Tom said, his voice more desperate now. "I'm asking you to help us. We've got kids now. This isn't just about me or Karen. We're your family." I felt a pang of guilt at that, but I wasn't going to back down, not after everything I'd been through. "Family? You weren't thinking about family when you threw me out. You weren't thinking about family when you let Karen lie about me. I had to figure it out on my own, Tom. Now it's your turn." There was another long pause. I could hear the frustration in his breathing again, but this time he didn't argue. He knew I was right. "Look," I continued, softening my tone just a little, "I'm not saying I don't care, but I can't let you stay with me. I've worked hard to rebuild my life, and I'm finally in a good place. I can't let you and Karen come in and mess that up again. You understand that, right?" "Yeah," Tom muttered. "I get it." It wasn't the answer he wanted, but I wasn't going to budge. I wasn't about to let him guilt trip me into giving in. I'd come too far for that. "I'll help in other ways," I offered, feeling like I had to throw him something. "I'll help you find resources or places you can stay. But my home? That's off limits." There was a long silence on the other end, and for a second I thought Tom had hung up. But then he sighed, long and deep, like he was finally accepting it. "Okay," he said, his voice quieter now. "I understand. I'm not happy about it, but I understand." I let out a breath I didn't even realize I was holding. It wasn't easy telling my own brother no, but I had to protect myself first. If I let him and Karen back into my life like that, I knew things would just end up the same as before, and I couldn't handle that again. "I really do hope things get better for you guys," I said, trying to end the conversation on a less tense note. "I'm sorry things are so hard right now." "Yeah, me too," Tom muttered. "Thanks for whatever help you can give." We said our awkward goodbyes, and that was that. I hung up the phone and just sat there for a minute, processing everything. I had said no. For once in my life, I had stood up for myself against my own family, and it felt weird. Part of me was proud, but another part was sad. I didn't like the idea of being estranged from Tom forever, but I knew this was the right thing to do. I had to draw the line somewhere. Over the next few days, I kept thinking about that conversation, replaying it in my head. I wasn't sure if Tom was mad at me or if he really understood where I was coming from, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let myself be guilted into something I wasn't comfortable with. My parents, of course, found out about the whole thing and tried to jump in with their family sticks together routine. They couldn't believe I said no, even after I explained everything that had happened with Tom and Karen. It's like they just didn't want to see the bigger picture. "You should have helped them," my mom told me during one of our phone calls. "They're struggling, and you've always been the one to help. This isn't like you." That last part stung a bit. Maybe it wasn't like me, but maybe that was the point. I'd always been the one to bend over backward for family, no matter how they treated me. But that's exactly why I had to say no this time. I wasn't the same person I was before. I had grown, learned to set boundaries, and this was one of them. I'm sorry, Mom, I said, trying to stay calm. But I've got to put myself first for once. Tom and Karen can figure it out. My parents didn't really get it, but that didn't surprise me. They weren't the ones who had been kicked out and left to fend for themselves. They weren't the ones who had to rebuild everything from scratch. I was, and I wasn't going to let anyone make me feel bad for protecting what I'd worked so hard to build. After that, things went quiet for a while. I didn't hear much from Tom or Karen, which was fine with me. They had their own problems to deal with, and I had mine. I helped them find a shelter that could take them in for a while, and that was the last I heard about it. No more desperate calls, no more guilt-tripping texts, and for the first time in a long time, I felt free. This story is titled, "My Family Stole the Business I Started, but Karma Hit Them Hard. Now they're asking for my help." Guys, before we start the video, I just saw something crazy. 82% of you watching right now aren't subscribed. If you're already here enjoying the content, why not hit that subscribe button? It's completely free, takes just a second, and it really helps the channel grow so I can keep bringing you more stories you love. Now let's start the video. OP starts by saying, "Alright, so here's how this all started. My family has always been about business. But let's be clear, they've never owned anything. They've spent their lives working under someone else, clocking in, and thinking they're living the dream because they got a decent paycheck and a pat on the back at the company Christmas party. My dad, corporate lifer. My uncle, same boat, just a fancier job title. And my brother? He wasn't anything special either, just another cog in the machine. Me, though? I wasn't about to waste my life like that. I wanted something more. So after slogging through some soul-sucking jobs to save up cash, I decided to start my own thing, a startup. I had a solid idea, but what I didn't have was enough money. That's when I turned to my family. I sat them down and pitched my business idea like I was on Shark Tank. I told them, if you guys help me get investors, I'll give you stakes in the company. Simple, right? They weren't exactly doing me a favor. They were getting a piece of the pie if it worked out. To my surprise, they actually came through. I mean, I didn't think they'd take me seriously at first. My dad's the kind of guy who thinks entrepreneurship is just a fancy way of saying unemployed. But they pulled some strings, called up a few people they knew, and boom, I had investors. Not just any investors either. These were the real deal. People with money and connections. I was floored. For once, I felt like my family actually believed in me. And they didn't just stop at finding investors. They started getting involved in the business itself, tossing around ideas, offering advice, and even helping with some of the grunt work. I thought it was great at the time. I was like, wow, my family actually has my back. I didn't see it for what it really was. The beginning of them worming their way into something they didn't build. Anyway, I busted my ass getting this company off the ground. Late nights, early mornings, skipped meals. It was a grind like nothing I'd ever experienced before. But it paid off. By the second year, my startup blew up. I'm talking real success, enough money to make my head spin. We were making deals left and right, and I finally felt like all my hard work was paying off. That's when my family started showing up more. At first, I didn't think much of it. My dad and uncle quit their jobs to work with me full time, and my brother did the same. I thought it was awesome. I mean, who wouldn't want their family involved in something so personal and important? My dad would show up to meetings, pretending he was the big boss, even though he didn't understand half the stuff we were discussing. My uncle started acting like he was some kind of business guru because he had a background in finance. And my brother? That dude didn't know shit about running a company, but he strutted around the office like he was Elon Musk or something. Looking back, there were so many red flags I should have seen, but I didn't. I was too caught up in the success to notice. I mean, how could I complain? My company was thriving, and my family was finally coming together. My brother and I, who used to fight like cats and dogs over the dumbest stuff, were actually getting along. We weren't arguing about whose turn it was to take out the trash, or who mom loved more. We were working together. It felt like my business had healed all the old wounds between us. I was proud. Hell, I thought this was what success was supposed to feel like. But man, was I wrong. So damn wrong. I think back to all the little things I ignored, like how my family kept telling me to watch my back around my friends and employees. They'd say shit like, "You never know who's just trying to use you," or "Be careful with your girlfriend. She might just be here for the money." At the time, I thought they were looking out for me. I mean, who wouldn't trust their own family? But now I realize they were planting seeds. They wanted me to think that the only people I could trust were them. And the worst part? I fell for it. At the time, I wasn't even that rich. Sure, I was doing well, but I wasn't rolling in cash like some billionaire. My friends and employees weren't out to screw me over. They were just doing their jobs and living their lives. But my family? They were slowly positioning themselves, making sure I leaned on them for everything. The first real crack in the facade came during the pandemic. Everything went remote, and we started doing meetings online. That's when the power plays started. Suddenly, my ideas weren't good enough anymore. The same ideas that built the company were now being shot down left and right. My dad and uncle would gang up on me during meetings, and my brother would sit there like a smug little asshole nodding along with whatever they said. They'd suggest their own half-baked ideas, acting like they were the saviors of the company. It was exhausting. I went from loving my job to dreading it. The company I built, the place that gave me a sense of purpose, was turning into a source of anxiety and stress. And the worst part? I didn't know how to stop it. My family wasn't just employees. They were part owners now. They had stakes in the company, and they weren't afraid to use that power against me. At the time, I brushed it off, thinking, it's just a rough patch. We'll get through it. But deep down, I think I knew things were starting to go downhill. My family wasn't here to help me. They were here to take over, and I was too blind to see it. Looking back, I can't believe how stupid I was. The signs were all there, glaringly obvious, but I ignored every single one of them because I was too wrapped up in the idea of having my family by my side. I thought, this is great. We're a team now. Yeah, a team of backstabbing assholes waiting for the perfect moment to screw me over. It started small, like most betrayals do. During our online meetings, they'd interrupt me mid-sentence to offer their perspective. My dad would say stuff like, I don't think that's the right direction for the company, as if he had a clue what the right direction even was. My uncle, Mr. Finance Genius, would constantly throw out buzzwords he barely understood. And my brother? That smug little shit would just sit there, nodding along like their hype man, occasionally chiming in with, yeah, I agree with Dad. At first, I thought they were just being overly enthusiastic. I mean, they were new to this level of business, so I figured they were trying to find their footing. But the interruptions turned into challenges, and the challenges turned into outright dismissals. The ideas I brought to the table, the same ideas that had gotten the company off the ground, were suddenly outdated or not innovative enough. It wasn't just during meetings either. My brother started taking credit for stuff he had no hand in. We landed a big client, one I had been working on for months, and somehow he spun it like he was the one who made it happen. I let it slide because I didn't want to rock the boat. It's just a small thing, I told myself. It's not worth the fight. But those small things started piling up. Then there were the constant family meetings. They'd corner me after work or during lunch breaks to talk about how we should be running the company. My dad had this habit of saying, you need to start thinking about the big picture, as if I hadn't been the one with the big picture to begin with. My uncle kept bringing up these ridiculous cost-cutting measures that would have gutted the team. And my brother? He just parroted whatever they said, pretending he was this brilliant strategist when he couldn't strategize his way out of a paper bag. One time during one of these so-called meetings, my dad told me, you're too close to this. You need to let other people take the reins. I laughed it off at the time, thinking he was just being dramatic. But now I realize it wasn't just a suggestion, it was a warning. They weren't here to help me run the company. They were here to take it from me. The breaking point, though, came during the pandemic. I think being stuck at home gave them too much time to scheme. We had to make some tough decisions. Cutting costs, shifting priorities, that sort of thing. It was stressful as hell, but I was doing my best to steer the ship. That's when the mutiny started. During one of our online meetings, I brought up a plan to pivot some of our operations to adapt to the lockdowns. It was a solid idea, something I had put a lot of thought into. But before I could even finish explaining, my dad cut me off. I don't think that's going to work, he said, like he was the CEO or something. My uncle jumped in, agreeing with him, and my brother, because of course, sided with them. They proposed their own plan, which was basically just rehashing what we were already doing, but with fancier words. I tried to push back, but they steamrolled me. They had the majority vote, so their shitty plan got approved, and mine got tossed aside. That meeting was the first time I felt like an outsider in my own company. I couldn't even recognize the business I had built. These people, my own family, were turning it into things got worse from there. My brother, who had no clue how to manage anything, started acting like he was running the show. He'd send out emails to the team, signing off as if he were the CEO, and even started making decisions without consulting me. When I confronted him about it, he brushed it off. I'm just taking initiative, he said, like I should be proud of him. My dad and uncle weren't any better. They started holding meetings without me, making decisions behind my back. When I found out, they acted like it was no big deal. We didn't want to bother you, my dad said, as if I wasn't the one who created this damn company in the first place. I tried to push back, but it was like talking to a brick wall. They had me outnumbered, and they knew it. Every time I brought up an issue, they'd gang up on me, making me feel like I was the problem. "You're being too emotional," my uncle would say, like I wasn't allowed to care about the business I built from the ground up. And my brother? That little shit had the nerve to tell me, "Maybe you should take a step back and let us handle things for a while." The audacity of that guy still pisses me off when I think about it. By the time we hit the midpoint of the lockdowns, I was miserable. My anxiety was through the roof, and I was having panic attacks before meetings. The company I once loved felt like a prison, and my family were the wardens. I knew something had to give, but I wasn't ready to admit just how bad things had gotten. It wasn't until later that I realized what they were doing. They weren't just undermining me. They were setting the stage to push me out entirely. And like an idiot, I let them. The whole situation turned into something straight out of a bad drama series. Except it was my life. The writing was on the wall for a while, but I was too wrapped up in trying to fix things to see what was coming. It all started with a mid-year meeting. I came into the meeting prepared, thinking it would be a tough but straightforward discussion. I should have known better. Right out of the gate, my uncle, in all his smug glory, suggested that maybe I should be on the chopping block. At first, I thought it was a joke. I mean, who says that to the person who built the company from scratch? But nope, he was dead serious. He started talking about how my brother had stepped up during the pandemic and was now handling most of the responsibilities. According to him, it only made sense for my brother to officially take over my role. I was floored. My brother taking over my role? The same guy who thought profit margins were something you color-coded on a spreadsheet? The same guy who once confused gross revenue with net profit during a client presentation? You've got to be kidding me. Before I could even process what was happening, my dad chimed in. He had the audacity to suggest that I either step down voluntarily or accept a demotion, in my own company. He said it with this fake-ass tone like he was doing me a favor, like he was being the reasonable one in the room. "We just think it's for the best," he said, as if I was some intern who had screwed up too many coffee orders. I looked around the virtual meeting, waiting for someone, anyone, to defend me. But no. My uncle nodded along like a bobblehead, and my brother, that little snake didn't even have the guts to make eye contact with the camera. He just stared at his desk, probably hoping I wouldn't call him out. I tried to argue, but they shut me down so fast it was like they'd rehearsed it. My dad started talking about how business is business, and how I needed to separate my emotions from the company's needs. My uncle backed him up, throwing in some bullshit about the greater good, and how my brother was the natural leader now. The whole thing was a setup, and I walked right into it. They voted me out, just like that. My own family voted me out of my company. I didn't even know what to say. I just sat there, staring at the screen, trying to figure out how the hell I'd let it get to this point. These were the people I trusted most in the world, and they stabbed me in the back without so much as a second thought. The rest of the meeting was a blur. They moved on like nothing had happened, talking about next steps and assigning responsibilities. My responsibilities to my brother. It was like I didn't exist anymore. I logged off without saying a word. What could I say? Anything I wanted to scream at them would have just made me look even worse. After the meeting, I sat in my office for hours, staring at the wall. I couldn't believe it. My family, my own flesh and blood, had just kicked me out of the company I built with my blood, sweat, and tears. I felt like an idiot for ever trusting them. All those late nights, all the sacrifices, all the times I went above and beyond to make sure the company succeeded. It didn't mean shit to them. They saw an opportunity to take over, and they took it. I spent the next few days in a daze, trying to figure out what to do. Part of me wanted to fight back, to lawyer up and sue their asses into oblivion. But the other part of me, the part that was tired, broken, and just plain done, wanted to walk away. The thought of going back to that toxic environment made my skin crawl. I knew I wouldn't survive another day in that hellhole. In the end, I chose to resign. Maybe it was the coward's way out, but I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't keep pretending like everything was fine when it was tearing me apart inside. So I wrote up my resignation letter, sent it off, and that was that. I was officially out. Leaving the company was like ripping off a scab that hadn't fully healed. It stung like hell, but there was a strange sense of relief too. I was free from the backstabbing and manipulation, but I was also out on my own with nothing but my savings and a bruised ego. It wasn't exactly a movie moment where the hero walks off into the sunset with a triumphant grin. No, it was more like walking into a storm, clutching a broken umbrella, and hoping to make it out alive. The first few months after resigning were rough. I had to move out of my cushy apartment and into a much smaller place to cut costs. Selling my car was next, which felt like another punch to the gut. That car was one of the few luxuries I'd allowed myself after years of grinding. But it had to go. My pride wasn't going to pay the bills. Starting over wasn't just about finances, though. It was about finding a way to rebuild my confidence. I spent weeks spiraling, questioning everything. Was I even capable of building another business? Or was my family right? Was I just lucky the first time? I hated that their voices were still in my head, even after I'd cut them out of my life. Eventually, I got tired of feeling sorry for myself. One morning, I woke up, looked around my tiny apartment, and thought, this isn't it. This can't be where my story ends. That's when I decided to stop sulking and start working. I didn't know what the hell my next move was going to be, but I knew I had to make one. I started brainstorming ideas for a new business, something completely different from what I'd done before. I didn't want anything that reminded me of the old company or the people who ruined it for me. It had to be mine, something I could pour myself into without anyone else's fingerprints on it. The first few ideas were trash, half-baked concepts that wouldn't have made it past the planning phase. But eventually, I landed on something that felt right. I won't get into the specifics, but let's just say it was an industry I was passionate about and one I knew I could excel in. The problem? I didn't have the kind of cash I had when I started my first company. Back then, I had investors and family support. Now it was just me, my savings, and a few favors I could call in. It was terrifying, but at the same time, it was exhilarating. For the first time in years, I felt like I was in control of my own destiny. No one else was pulling the strings. It was just me. Building the new business was a grind, even harder than the first time. I was working 12 to 14-hour days, juggling a million tasks at once. Some days, I didn't even know if I'd have enough money to make it to the next week. I lived off ramen and instant coffee, the kind of diet that screams broke entrepreneur. But I didn't care. Every small step forward felt like a victory. The loneliness was the hardest part. My family was gone, blocked on every platform I could think of. They didn't deserve access to my life anymore. I cut ties with anyone who even remotely reminded me of them, which meant my social circle got a lot smaller. The only person who stuck around was my wife. She was my rock, the one person who believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. If it weren't for her, I don't think I would have made it through those first few months. About a year in, things finally started turning around. The new business began to take shape, and by some miracle, it started generating revenue. It wasn't much at first, just enough to keep the lights on, but it was a start, and that was all I needed. A small glimmer of hope to keep me going. By the second year, the business was thriving. It wasn't just doing well, it was doing better than my first company ever had. I finally felt like I was back on solid ground. And the best part? This time, I was surrounded by people I trusted. No family drama, no bullshit, just a tight-knit team of people who believed in the vision as much as I did. Cutting off my family was one of the hardest decisions I'd ever made, but it was also the most freeing. I didn't just block their numbers, I erased them from my life completely. My dad, my uncle, my brother, they were dead to me. Not literally, obviously, but you get the point. These were people who had no problem screwing me over when it suited them, and I wasn't about to let them back in, just because things were finally going well for me. At first, I didn't even think about them. I was so focused on rebuilding my life that they didn't cross my mind. But every now and then, a memory would creep in, a moment from before things went to hell. I'd remember the good times, like when my brother and I used to play video games together, or when my dad gave me advice about life. Those memories made it harder to stay angry, but then I'd remind myself of what they did. They didn't just betray me. They betrayed everything we were supposed to stand for as a family. And that's not something you just forgive and forget. Then came the shocker. I found out my old company was tanking. A mutual friend who used to work there gave me the rundown. After I left, my family basically stopped giving a shit. My dad, my uncle, and my brother treated it like their personal ATM, draining money to buy luxury cars and other crap they didn't need. Meanwhile, they let the actual business fall apart. Employees started leaving in droves, clients jumped ship, and the company that I built from nothing was circling the drain. Hearing that pissed me off more than I thought it would. I'd worked my ass off to make that company a success, and they destroyed it in less than 2 years. Part of me wanted to gloat, to laugh at their failure, but another part of me just felt sad. Not for them, obviously. They deserved whatever was coming to them. But for the company. It didn't deserve to go down like that. By the time I heard about their mess, I was already too far gone emotionally to care. My focus was on my new business, my new life, and the people who actually gave a damn about me. As far as I was concerned, my family could sink with the ship they'd stolen from me. I was finally in a good place. My new business was thriving. My personal life felt stable, and I'd moved on. Or at least I thought I had. But of course, life has a way of dragging you back into the mess you thought you'd escaped. And, surprise, surprise, the mess came in the form of my brother. It all started when I was reviewing resumes for a senior position in my company. I'd worked my ass off to build a solid team, and now we were growing fast enough to start filling higher-level roles. I was scrolling through the shortlisted candidates when I saw his name, my brother. Seeing his name on that list was like getting sucker punched. My first reaction was to laugh. Like, what the hell was this guy doing applying for a job? Didn't he still have my old company to play pretend CEO with? But the more I thought about it, the more curious I got. Something didn't add up. There was no way he'd be applying for a job unless things had really gone to shit. I decided to schedule the interview, not because I wanted to hire him, but because I needed answers. The day of the interview, he walked into my office looking like a ghost of his former self. He'd aged at least 10 years in the span of 2. His suit was wrinkled, his hair was a mess, and he had this defeated look on his face like life had beaten him into submission. For a second, just a second, I felt bad for him. But then I remembered everything he did to me, and any sympathy I had disappeared. He froze when he saw me sitting behind the desk. His jaw tightened, and I could see the panic in his eyes, but he tried to play it cool. "Michael," he said, forcing a smile. "I didn't know this was your company." "Small world," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Let's get started, shall we?" The interview was awkward, painfully so. He stumbled over basic questions and gave vague, half-assed answers about his experience. It was obvious he wasn't qualified for the job, not even close. But I let him dig his own grave. I stayed professional, taking notes and nodding along, even though my brain was screaming, "Are you serious right now?" By the time we wrapped up, I'd made up my mind. There was no way in hell I was hiring him. As he stood to leave, I hit him with the same line he'd thrown at me during that fateful meeting years ago. "I think your contributions would be better suited to a lower-level role. You might want to consider applying for something more appropriate." The look on his face was priceless. He went from shocked to pissed in about 2 seconds flat. "Are you kidding me?" he snapped. "This is unprofessional as hell. You're letting your personal feelings cloud your judgment." I leaned back in my chair, trying not to laugh. "You're free to leave if you don't like it," I said, echoing his own words from all those years ago. And just like that, he stormed out, slamming the door behind him. I thought that was the end of it, but of course, it wasn't. Within hours, my phone started blowing up. Texts, calls, voicemails, all from my family. My dad accused me of sabotaging my brother's career out of spite. My uncle went on a rant about how I was disrespecting the family. Even my mom, who had been mostly silent throughout this whole ordeal, chimed in, begging me to be the bigger person and give my brother another chance. The cherry on top? My wife. She'd always been supportive of me, but even she started questioning my decision. "Maybe you should reconsider," she said one night. "He has a family to support. Kids, Michael. Think about the kids." I wanted to scream. Why was everyone acting like this was my problem? My brother had made his bed, and now he had to lie in it. He didn't care about me when he was voting me out of my own company. So why the hell should I care about him now? But the guilt started creeping in, as much as I hated to admit it. I couldn't shake the image of him sitting in my office, looking like a broken man. Was I being petty? Was I letting my anger get the best of me? I didn't know anymore. A few days later, I got a call from a mutual friend who used to work at my old company. He filled in the blanks for me, and holy shit, it was worse than I thought. Apparently, after I left, my family treated the business like their personal piggy bank. They bought luxury cars, threw lavish parties, and basically acted like royalty. Meanwhile, the actual business was falling apart. Clients were leaving, employees were quitting, and the company was hemorrhaging money. By the time the pandemic ended, it was a complete disaster. "They thought the company would run itself," my friend said. "They didn't realize how much work you were actually doing." Hearing that felt like a twisted kind of validation. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining things. My family had been riding my coattails all along. Without me, they were nothing. But the validation didn't make the situation any less messy. Now I had a decision to make. Part of me wanted to swoop in and buy the company back. It was still salvageable, according to my friend, but only if it was under new management. And by new management, I mean anyone but my dad, uncle, or brother. I'd have to cut them out completely, which wouldn't be easy. They'd fight me every step of the way, but honestly, I was ready for it. The other part of me wanted to walk away. Let them burn. They made their bed, and now they could deal with the consequences. Why should I step in and save them from their own stupidity? In the end, I decided to meet with them. Not because I wanted to reconcile, but because I wanted closure. I needed to tell them, face to face, that they were out and I was taking back what was mine. No more games, no more manipulation. Just the cold, hard truth. When I walked into that meeting, they looked desperate. My dad tried to play it cool, but I could see the panic in his eyes. My uncle was fidgeting, and my brother wouldn't even look at me. They knew they were screwed. I'll buy the company, I said, cutting straight to the point. But under one condition. You're all out. No stakes, no positions, nothing. You walk away with the cash, and that's it. They argued, of course. My dad said it was unfair. My uncle claimed he deserved a role. And my brother, well, he just sat there sulking. But in the end, they caved. They needed the money more than they needed the pride. Walking out of that meeting felt damn good. For the first time in years, I felt like I'd won. I took back what was mine, and I did it on my terms. My family can keep their guilt trips and their sob stories. I'm done with them. My stepmother tried to break off my engagement as a joke by sending my fiancé photoshopped pictures of me with my lover. So I exposed her for the witch she is, and my dad divorced her. Now she is blowing up my phone, begging me to convince my father to take her back because she has no money or job. So, I guess I should start from the beginning because otherwise none of this will make any sense. My name's Ben, I'm 27 and I'm getting married in 3 weeks. Or at least that's the plan. But of course, someone had to go and try to mess it up. I've been with my fiancée Katie for 10 years now. We've been through all the ups and downs you can think of. You know, normal stuff like graduating, getting jobs, surviving our early 20s together. It was all going smoothly, until my stepmom, Karen, decided to blow everything up. Now, Karen's been in my life since I was 14. She married my dad, Tom, when I was in 8th grade. Back then, she seemed pretty cool. I didn't really think much about it at the time. I figured, hey, if my dad's happy, I'm happy. I'd split my time between my mom's place and my dad's, and Karen, well, she acted nice enough at first. You know how people put on that face when they want to make sure you don't mess things up for them? Yeah, that was her. But after they got married, things started to change. Slowly, she started showing her true colors. And let me tell you, they weren't pretty. She'd take little jabs at me when my dad wasn't around. Like, if I had a bad grade or I left a mess somewhere, she'd act like it was the end of the world. But when my dad was there, she was sweet as pie. Made me feel like I was losing my mind sometimes because no one else ever saw her acting like that. There was this one time, I must have been around 15, and I'd just failed a math test. I was already beating myself up about it, but when I got home, Karen let loose. She gave me this whole speech about how I wasn't applying myself, and that if I didn't get my act together, I'd end up like my mother. Yeah, she went there. I told my dad about it later, and he was like, no, that doesn't sound like her at all. You must be misunderstanding. Misunderstanding? Man, I was living with it. At first, I blamed myself. I figured I must have done something to set her off. Maybe I wasn't being welcoming enough or something. But then I realized that was complete BS. Karen didn't have a problem with me. She had a problem with me existing. See, to her, I was this reminder that my dad had a whole other life before her, and I think that really ate at her, so she started picking at me to get me out of the way. When I finally talked to my dad about it, I thought he'd have my back. We sat down, all three of us, for this family meeting. Karen, of course, acted like the victim. She started crying, actual tears, saying she had no idea why I hated her so much. She claimed I'd always been rude to her, never accepted her, and that she was just doing her best to make me feel like part of the family. My dad ate it up. I got kicked out of the conversation and left her alone with him, but I didn't go far. I stayed right outside the door and listened in, because I was desperate to know what was really going on. What I heard? Man, it was like a punch to the gut. She straight up told my dad that I was jealous of her and that I wanted my parents to get back together, so I was making up lies to get her out of the picture. She even said she thought I was the reason none of his other relationships worked out before her. Like, really? The kid was ruining his love life? I mean, get real. That was the moment I realized Karen wasn't just messing with me. She was playing some twisted game and she was winning. My dad was totally hooked on her. I figured if I said anything more, it would just make me look bad, so I shut up. I told myself I'd just tough it out, not give her the satisfaction of seeing me lose my cool. But here's the thing. When you hold on to all that crap for years, it starts to wear on you. Fast forward to now, and Karen's still around. My relationship with her has always been cold, but when I moved out for college, it got easier. I didn't have to deal with her much anymore. I'd only see her on holidays, and by then I could ignore her little digs. She kept up the act, of course, always trying to get under my skin. Like, she'd ask me stuff like, "So, Ben, when are you going to settle down?" Or, "Do you really think Katie's the one for you?" Speaking of Katie, she's been my rock through all this. She's met Karen, knows the whole story, and even though she was polite to her, she's always known Karen had it out for me. But Katie, she's not easily fooled. She knows me better than anyone. Anyway, a couple of weeks ago, right when everything should have been coming together for the wedding, Karen pulls this stunt. Katie gets this text from Karen totally out of nowhere with these fake photos of me and another woman. The woman in the photos? I barely know her. She's like a neighbor from my old neighborhood, and the pictures were from some group hangout. But Karen had photoshopped it to look like I was with this woman, just the two of us, all cozy like we were on a date or something. Then she went ahead and told Katie that I'd been cheating on her with this woman for months. She even wrote this whole dramatic message about how she was looking out for Katie and didn't want her to marry someone who'd betray her. Can you imagine? My stepmom trying to ruin my life by faking an affair 2 weeks before my wedding? What kind of person does that? But here's where she messed up. Karen thought Katie would freak out and dump me on the spot. She told her not to even bring it up with me, saying it would just cause unnecessary drama and that she didn't want to get in the middle of it. Yeah, right. Karen didn't want to get caught, is what that was. But she underestimated Katie. Instead of believing Karen, Katie came straight to me, showed me the pictures, and asked what the hell was going on. I was in shock. I mean, I knew Karen was petty, but this was a whole new level. I explained everything to Katie, and she believed me right away. She knows me, she knows Karen, and honestly, the photoshopping job was pretty bad. Like, come on, Karen, at least try harder if you're going to sabotage my life. That's when I decided enough was enough. I called my dad that night absolutely livid. I laid everything out for him, the photos, the lies, the years of crap I'd put up with, and I gave him a choice. Either he kicks Karen out, or I cut them both off. I wasn't playing games anymore. This wasn't just about me. This was about my future with Katie. I wasn't going to let Karen ruin that. So yeah, that's where things started. But trust me, it gets a lot worse from here. So after I made that call to my dad, things really started to get intense. I'm not going to lie, I didn't expect him to handle it well. I figured he'd be all confused and probably not know how to react, but when I laid everything out for him, I could tell right away that he was shaken. I think he knew deep down that Karen wasn't who she pretended to be. I mean, no one's that good at hiding who they really are for that long. But even so, he sounded like he needed time to process it all. He told me, "Ben, I'll talk to her. Let me figure this out." Which honestly wasn't what I wanted to hear. Like, at this point, what's left to figure out? The woman photoshopped pictures of me cheating to blow up my relationship. That's not something you just talk about. But I gave him the space, told him to call me back when he'd decided what to do. I didn't feel great about it. I mean, Katie and I are about to get married, and instead of feeling excited, I'm dealing with this insane family drama. But whatever, I thought. I had no choice but to wait it out. A couple of days passed, and I hadn't heard back from my dad. So I tried to stay focused on the wedding plans and all that. Katie, bless her heart, was handling this way better than I was. She kept saying, "Don't worry, Ben, we're going to be fine. Karen's not going to ruin anything." And I wanted to believe her. But I also knew Karen wasn't the type to just back down. I was pretty sure she had more tricks up her sleeve. Then, one night, I get this call from my dad. It's late, like way past the time he'd normally call. Right away, I knew something was up. He sounds, I don't know, defeated? That's the only way I can describe it. He tells me that he confronted Karen about everything, and she denied it all at first, tried to play dumb like she didn't know what he was talking about. Now, you gotta understand, my dad's not the type to just let stuff slide. He's a pretty calm guy, but when he's mad, he's mad. He doesn't blow up, but he gets that serious, quiet tone, and you know he's not messing around. Apparently, that's what happened. He kept pressing her, showing her the texts, the pictures, everything. At first, Karen tried to laugh it off, saying it was all a misunderstanding or some kind of joke. Can you believe that? A joke. Like sending fake cheating photos right before your stepson's wedding is something to laugh about. But my dad wasn't buying it. He kept at her until she finally broke down and admitted it. But here's where it gets even crazier. She didn't just own up to it, she tried to justify it. She told my dad that she was worried about him. She said she was scared that if he paid for my wedding, I'd just keep asking him for more money. She went on this whole rant about how she thought I was going to bleed him dry and that she was just trying to protect their finances. Like, really? That's what she was worried about? And then she started crying. Again, typical Karen. and telling him she only did it out of love for him. That's her whole move, by the way. She screws up, then tries to guilt people by saying she's doing it for their own good. But my dad wasn't having it this time. He told her that this wasn't about money. This was about her trying to destroy our relationship. And honestly, for the first time in my life, I think he actually saw through her BS. I don't know exactly what happened next, but I do know my dad kicked her out. He told her to pack her things and leave, and just like that, she was gone. He said she didn't even try to fight it, just left in silence. I'm not gonna lie, when he told me that, I felt this massive weight lift off my shoulders. It's like all those years of dealing with her crap had finally come to an end. But here's the thing, it wasn't really the end. Not even close. Karen didn't just disappear into the night like I hoped she would. Oh no, she immediately started blowing up my phone. Calls, texts, emails, you name it. She was trying every way possible to get me to convince my dad to take her back. At first, I ignored her, because honestly, I wasn't about to entertain her nonsense. But she kept at it. She started saying stuff like, I didn't mean for this to happen, and I was just trying to protect our family. And here's the part that really got me. She tried to make it seem like I owed her, like somehow it was my responsibility to fix things between her and my dad. She even threw in some sob story about how she didn't have any money or a place to go. She'd quit her job a few years ago to focus on family, more like focusing on controlling everything, so now she was basically broke. That's not my problem though, is it? I wasn't the one who photoshopped fake cheating pics. She sent me this long email from a new address because I'd blocked her on everything else. It was full of all these guilt-tripping lines like, I never meant to hurt you, Ben, and I love your father more than anything. She even threw in some crap about how she always tried to be a good stepmother to me. That's when I really lost it. Like, were we living in the same reality? Because the Karen I know has been a nightmare from day one. I didn't respond to any of her messages, obviously, but I did show them to my dad, just so he could see what she was trying to pull. He was pissed, but he told me to just let it go, that he'd handle it. I knew that meant he was done with her for good, which was a relief. Still, it wasn't easy to just move on. I kept thinking about how close she came to ruining everything. If Katie hadn't trusted me, if she'd believed those fake photos, who knows where we'd be right now? I probably wouldn't be sitting here planning a wedding, that's for sure. So, yeah, things were looking up, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't done. I mean, she's always been sneaky. She's always had this way of getting what she wants, and I knew she wasn't going to go down without a fight. But for now, I had to focus on the wedding. It was just a couple of weeks away, and after all the drama, I just wanted one thing to go smoothly. But knowing Karen, that wasn't going to happen. Update 1. So, after my dad kicked Karen out, you'd think things would start calming down, right? Nope. Karen, being Karen, had to keep dragging it out. I was already dealing with wedding stress, and now I had her constantly trying to weasel her way back into our lives. I figured blocking her everywhere would be enough, but then she got creative. Katie and I were out one day, checking out some last-minute wedding stuff, and we decided to grab lunch at this cafe near the venue. Everything felt good. We were relaxed, laughing, finally feeling like the wedding was close and we could just enjoy it. Then, right in the middle of our meal, I get a notification. It's Karen. She'd somehow found a way to email me again from yet another account. I guess she really couldn't take the hint. I didn't even want to read it at first. Katie told me to just ignore it, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened it up, and it was the same old crap. More apologies. More fake remorse. She kept saying how she didn't mean to ruin everything, and how she just wanted the best for all of us. But the tone of the email was off. She was more desperate this time. I could tell she was getting freaked out about the whole situation. She mentioned how she was staying in some cheap motel and running low on money. She was practically begging me to talk to my dad, to fix things between them. She wrote stuff like, "You're the only one who can make this right, Ben. Your father listens to you." Yeah, Karen, he listens to me now because you finally showed him who you really are. The email went on for way too long, but what really caught my attention was this one part where she said, "I'll make sure to stay out of your lives if you just help me get back on my feet." Now that got to me. She was literally trying to bargain her way back in by promising to leave us alone. I showed the email to Katie and she just rolled her eyes. "Ben, she's never going to leave us alone," she said. And honestly, she was right. Karen wasn't someone who could just fade away quietly. That wasn't her style. I didn't reply to the email, obviously. But now I was starting to get this nagging feeling like she wasn't done trying to mess things up. I hadn't talked to my dad in a couple of days, mainly because I didn't want to drag him into more of Karen's mess, but I figured I should at least update him. so I called him that night. When I told him about Karen's latest email, he wasn't surprised at all. In fact, he told me that Karen had been trying to contact him too. She'd left him voicemails, sent him texts, and even showed up at his office one day. He said he didn't let her in, just told security to make her leave. He sounded exhausted, like he was over all of it, and I didn't blame him. I mean, this woman had turned his whole life upside down. What really threw me, though, was what he said next. She mentioned something about seeing you and Katie soon, he said. I froze for a second. What did that even mean? What? Like she's going to show up at the wedding? I asked, half joking but half serious because, let's be honest, with Karen, anything was possible. My dad said he didn't know what she meant by it, but he told me to be prepared just in case. Now I was officially on edge. The last thing I needed was Karen pulling some stunt at the wedding. Katie and I talked about it that night, and we agreed that we'd hire extra security for the day. Yeah, it was a little over the top, but better safe than sorry, right? I wasn't about to let Karen crash my wedding after everything she'd already done. A couple of days later, we were in the final stretch before the big day, and things were actually looking good. We had a plan in place for the wedding, security was all set up, and I was feeling more at ease. Then, guess what? Karen strikes again. Katie and I were doing a final walkthrough of the venue with our wedding planner, and everything was going smoothly. We were talking about seating arrangements and flowers when suddenly, out of nowhere, I see her. Karen. She was standing at the edge of the parking lot, just staring at us. I almost couldn't believe it. Like, what the hell was she even doing there? How did she even know we'd be there? I didn't tell my dad about our plans for that day, so the only way she'd know is if she was straight up stalking us. I pointed her out to Katie, and we both just stood there, dumbfounded. I was pissed. I mean, after everything, she had the nerve to show up like that. So I walked over to her, trying to keep my cool. When I got close, she had this smug smile on her face, like she'd won some kind of game. Ben, she said in this fake, sweet voice, I just wanted to talk. Talk? Now she wanted to talk? I told her straight up, this isn't the time or place, Karen. You need to leave. She gave me this look, like she was trying to make me feel sorry for her. I've lost everything, she said. Your father won't even speak to me, and I just want to make things right. I didn't even know what to say at that point. Like, lady, you did this to yourself. You don't get to play the victim now. I just told her, look, Karen, we're done. You need to move on and stop messing with my life. That's when she really lost it. She started yelling, right there in the parking lot, about how I was selfish, how I'd ruined her marriage, how I was turning my dad against her. It was wild. At this point, the wedding planner and Katie were standing there watching, probably wondering what kind of family drama they'd just walked into. I didn't want to make a scene, so I just told Karen to leave, or I'd call the cops. That got her to back off. She stormed off, yelling something about how I'd regret this. I didn't care. I just wanted her gone. After she left, I stood there for a second trying to wrap my head around what just happened. Katie came up to me and put her arm around me. She's not going to ruin this for us, she said. And I believed her. Karen could throw all the tantrums she wanted. She wasn't going to stop this wedding. But man, after that, I was on edge again. I knew Karen wasn't going to give up that easily. And now, with the wedding just days away, I had no idea what she'd try next. Update 2. After Karen's meltdown at the venue, I was really hoping that would be the last of her. I mean, how many times can a person embarrass themselves before they get the message, right? But nope, I guess I underestimated her ability to keep coming back like a bad penny. The days leading up to the wedding were supposed to be fun, stress-free, you know? But instead I spent most of that time looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next disaster to drop. Katie, though, was a rock through all of it. I don't know how she managed to keep it together while I was losing my mind every other day. We had a long talk the night after Karen showed up at the venue, and Katie just kept saying, Ben, she can't control us. We're not letting her ruin this. And she was right. I had to stop letting Karen's drama get in my head. The next day, I went to pick up my tux from the rental place. Nothing too exciting, just one of those wedding checklist things. I was in a good mood because, for once, it felt like we were getting close to the finish line without another Karen-sized issue. I was wrong. I walk into the shop, and who do I see sitting on a bench outside? Yep, Karen. I swear she's like a professional stalker at this point. I almost turned around and left, but I wasn't going to let her scare me off. I had too much to do. As I walked past her, she stood up and blocked my path. Ben, please, just hear me out, she said. I could tell she was trying to act all calm and reasonable, but I wasn't having it. Karen, I don't have time for this. I told you to stop, I said. trying to keep it together, even though I was fuming inside. She didn't move. I need to talk to you. It's important. Just 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. I gave in, figuring maybe if I heard her out, she'd finally leave me alone. But deep down, I knew this wasn't going to end well. Fine, I said, crossing my arms. 5 minutes, go. She started rambling on about how she and my dad hadn't officially filed for divorce yet, and how she still had hope they could fix things. She kept saying how she regretted everything, and how she was willing to change. I just stood there, waiting for her to get to the point. Then she dropped the line that almost made me lose it. I was thinking, maybe if you talked to your dad, explained that this was all a misunderstanding, maybe he'd reconsider, she said. You know how much he respects your opinion. I stared at her, completely stunned. She still didn't get it. After everything she'd done, she still thought I'd be the one to fix things for her. Like, how delusional can someone be? Are you serious right now? I asked, not even trying to hide my frustration. You want me to help you after everything you've done? She looked at me with this pathetic expression, like she thought I was actually going to feel bad for her. Ben, I never meant to hurt you. I was just trying to protect our family. I love your father, and I love you too. I actually laughed. I couldn't help it. You love me? Really? You tried to ruin my wedding. You've made my life hell since the day you married my dad. And now you're asking for my help? She looked like she was going to cry, but I wasn't falling for it. Karen, you need to move on. It's over. My dad's done, and so am I. That's when she snapped. The calm, reasonable act went out the window. She started yelling right there in front of the shop about how I was turning my dad against her, how I was destroying her life. She even accused me of stealing my dad from her. It was wild. People walking by were staring, and I could feel my face getting hot from embarrassment. I didn't even bother responding. I just walked past her and went into the shop. I could hear her still yelling as I left her outside. The whole thing was a mess. Later that day, I called my dad to tell him what happened. He wasn't surprised. Apparently, Karen had been trying to pull the same stunt with him, showing up at his office, leaving notes at his door. He told me he was done with her, but honestly, I didn't believe him. I've seen too many people get sucked back into Karen's drama. She's like quicksand. The more you struggle, the deeper you get. I didn't hear from Karen for a few days after that, and I started to think maybe, just maybe, she'd finally gotten the hint. I was wrong. It was 2 days before the wedding, and Katie and I were meeting up with my parents for a final dinner before the big day. We were sitting at this nice little restaurant, just chatting about the wedding and the honeymoon plans, when my dad's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and I could see his face tense up. What's wrong? I asked, already knowing it wasn't good. It's Karen, he said, putting the phone down. She's threatening to show up at the wedding if I don't talk to her. My heart sank. I knew it. I knew she wouldn't just let it go. My dad looked at me, his face full of regret. I'm sorry, Ben. I thought I could handle it, but she's not backing down. Katie reached over and squeezed my hand. We'll figure this out, she said, but I could see the worry in her eyes too. We spent the rest of the night coming up with a plan. We couldn't risk Karen showing up and ruining the wedding. My dad offered to hire extra security, but I wasn't sure if that would be enough. I knew Karen. If she wanted to cause trouble, she'd find a way. As we were leaving the restaurant, my dad pulled me aside. Ben, I'm sorry you have to deal with this. I should have seen this coming a long time ago. I shook my head. It's not your fault, Dad. Karen's always been like this. We just didn't see it until now. He nodded, but I could tell he was beating himself up about it. I didn't blame him, though. Karen had fooled a lot of people over the years. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about what Karen might do. Part of me wanted to believe she wouldn't actually show up, but the other part of me knew she was desperate, and desperate people do desperate things. The wedding was 2 days away, and I had no idea what to expect. All I knew was that Karen wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Update 3. The wedding day finally came, and I was on edge from the moment I woke up. I mean, don't get me wrong, I was excited. I was finally marrying Katie, and that was all I ever wanted. But Karen had been lurking in the back of my mind for days, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she was going to try something. Even with the extra security we had lined up, I still felt like we weren't totally in the clear. Katie and I had talked about it 100 times. We knew there was a chance Karen would show up, and we were ready to handle it if she did. But honestly, we were both hoping she'd finally gotten the hint and would stay far away from our wedding. Spoiler, she didn't. I spent the morning getting ready with my groomsmen, just the usual stuff, trying to stay calm, joking around to keep my mind off the potential disaster that could be looming. The venue was all set up, and Katie was somewhere across the hall getting ready with her bridesmaids. I kept checking my phone, half expecting a message from my dad saying, Karen's here. but everything seemed fine so far. No news was good news, right? That was until about an hour before the ceremony. I was standing in the back room with my best man Mark when my phone buzzed. I saw it was a text from my dad, and my stomach immediately dropped. I opened it up, and sure enough, it was exactly what I didn't want to see. Karen's outside the venue. Security's holding her at the gate. I stared at the message for a second. Like maybe if I didn't respond, it would somehow make the problem go away. But I knew that wasn't how things worked. Karen had actually shown up. She'd really crossed that line. Mark saw the look on my face and asked what was up. I told him the situation, and he gave me this look like, dude, what do we even do now? I didn't have a clue, but I wasn't about to let Karen ruin the biggest day of my life. So I grabbed my phone and called my dad. He picked up right away. Ben, she's refusing to leave, he said, sounding exhausted. Security's doing their best, but she's making a scene. Of course she was. Karen never did anything quietly. What's she even saying? I asked, already dreading the answer. She's going on about how you're making a huge mistake, how she has proof that Katie isn't right for you. My dad sounded pissed. It's the same nonsense she's been spewing for weeks. All right, keep her there. Don't let her anywhere near the venue, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I'll be right out. I hung up and turned to Mark. I'm going to deal with this. Just keep Katie calm. Don't let her know what's going on, all right? Mark nodded. You got it, man. You sure you want to handle this? I didn't really want to, but what choice did I have? Karen wasn't going to leave unless I made it clear once and for all that she had no place in my life anymore. I walked out to the front of the venue, where the security guys were standing at the gate. Sure enough, there she was, standing there with that same look on her face, like she was some sort of martyr, like she was the victim here. It made me sick. The security guard spotted me and nodded. This her? He asked, like he didn't already know. Yeah, I sighed. I'll talk to her. Karen's eyes lit up when she saw me and she stepped forward, but the guard put his hand out to stop her. Ben, thank God, she said, like I was her savior or something. Please, just let me talk to you. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of thinking this was going to be a conversation. Karen, what the hell are you doing here? I said, keeping my distance. I'm trying to save you from making a huge mistake, she said, like she was genuinely concerned. I've been trying to reach you, but you keep shutting me out. You need to listen to me. Katie isn't right for you. She's been lying to you this whole time. Here we go again. I couldn't believe she was pulling this same crap even now. Karen, you're delusional, I said straight up. There's nothing you can say or do that's going to change what's happening today. I'm marrying Katie, and you're not welcome here. She flinched, like my words actually hurt her. Ben, please, I have proof. I overheard her talking to someone about how she's only with you for your money. She's going to ruin your life. I stared at her, completely dumbfounded. How far was she willing to go with this? She'd already faked photos of me cheating, and now she was making up some ridiculous lie about Katie. You really don't know when to quit, do you? I said, shaking my head. Katie doesn't care about my money, and you know that. You're just trying to tear us apart because you're miserable. She opened her mouth to argue, but I wasn't done. This ends now, Karen. You need to leave. I'm serious. You've already lost my dad, and if you keep this up, you'll lose any chance of ever having a relationship with me again. Get out of here, or I'll have security drag you out. Your choice. I could see her starting to panic. She wasn't used to people standing up to her like this. She was used to manipulating her way through situations, but this time, it wasn't working. She glanced at the security guys, then back at me, her face going pale. Please, Ben, don't do this, she said, her voice shaking now. I'm your family. No, you're not, I said, my voice steady. Not anymore. She stood there for a second, looking like she didn't know what to do. Then, finally, she turned and walked away. I watched her go, waiting to make sure she was really leaving. I didn't turn around until I saw her car pull out of the lot and disappear down the street. I let out a long breath, feeling the tension leave my body for the first time in weeks. She was gone, finally. When I walked back into the venue, Mark was waiting for me. Everything good? He asked. Yeah, I said, smiling for what felt like the first time all day. She's gone. He clapped me on the back. Good. Let's get you married, man. And that's exactly what happened. The ceremony went off without a hitch. Katie looked absolutely stunning. And when I saw her walking down the aisle, everything else just faded away. For the first time in forever, it felt like Karen wasn't looming over us anymore. It was just me, Katie, and the start of our new life together. And you know what? We had the perfect day. No more drama, no more Karen, just us.